The wards over Ashmere Hollow had not flickered in 300 years. Rhys felt it the way a man feels a held breath finally let go, a shudder through old stone and older magic, and he came up out of the ledgers on his desk with his pen still in hand. Somewhere in the village below the tree line, a binding was choosing its vessel. He set the pen down very carefully, because his hands did not shake, had not shaken since the century he stopped counting centuries, and he did not intend to start now over a woman he had not yet seen. The apothecary's shop on Miller Street smelled of dried yarrow and beeswax candles, and Selah had been standing on a stool reaching for a jar of comfrey root when the window glass had gone white with frost in the middle of summer. She did not scream. She had grown up on stories of the wood at the edge of the hollow, and the thing that ruled it, and some very old, very stubborn part of her recognized the cold for what it was before her mind caught up. By the time the coven's escort arrived at her door 2 hours later, polite and terrible in equal measure, she had already packed a bag, because refusing to go had never once been an option offered to anyone the wards chose. It was only ever a question of whether you walked or were carried. She walked. She would think of that later, as the first small victory in a war she had not yet realized she was fighting. Her mother had died the winter Selah turned 15, and it was her mother's voice she heard now, walking the tree-lined road toward the coven gates with the escort silent at her back, the same voice that had taught her which root stopped bleeding and which one started it. "You don't have to be brave," her mother used to say, sorting herbs by lamplight, hands quick and sure. "You only have to be useful enough that fear doesn't get to decide what happens next." Selah had spent 8 years since making herself useful to a village that mostly forgot to thank her for it, stitching wounds and setting bones and boiling down the same bitter tinctures her mother had taught her, and she was not about to let a spell older than the hollow itself decide, in a single afternoon, that all of that had only ever been preparation for becoming someone's bound wife. Whatever waited for her at the top of that mountain road, she intended to meet it standing. The manor received her the way old houses receive weather, indifferently, as if it had seen a great many women brought up its front steps, and had stopped being interested in how any particular one of them turned out. Rhys met her in the entry hall, dark-eyed and economical with her words, and led her through corridors hung with tapestries too old to have a colour left in them, into a study where a fire burned low, and a man stood at the window with his back to the door. He turned when Rhys announced her. Selah had expected, she was not entirely sure what she had expected, something with fangs bared, something that looked at her the way a butcher looks at a hanging carcass. What she found instead was a tall, unhurried man with dark hair, pulled back from a face that might have belonged to a scholar or a soldier, difficult to say which, and eyes the pale gold of old amber that studied her with an attention that felt less like hunger and more like an apology already forming.
Selah.
Not a question. The wards had told him that much at least.
I'm Rhys.
I know who you are.
Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which she counted as the second small victory.
Everyone in the hollow knows who you are. You're the reason we leave offerings at the tree line and pretend it's tradition instead of tribute.
Something flickered across his face there and gone that she would only later learn to recognize as rare. Amusement, maybe, or its distant, tired cousin.
That's fair. Sit down if you'd like. Or don't, I won't pretend either of us is going to relax through this conversation regardless.
She did not sit. She stood in the middle of the old study with her bag still over her shoulder and her spine very straight, and she said the thing she had rehearsed the whole ride up the mountain road, the thing she needed him to hear before anything else got said.
I won't do it. Whatever the wards think they've decided, I didn't agree to it, and I'm not going to pretend a spell cast before I was born gets to speak for me now.
Rhys was quiet for a moment. Outside, wind moved through the black pines, and somewhere below them in the manor's lower halls, a door closed with the particular hush of servants trying not to be heard eavesdropping.
Good.
Selah blinked.
Good.
I'd have been disappointed if you hadn't. He came away from the window unhurried and lowered himself into the chair across from where she stood, which put him below her eye line, a small deliberate thing she noticed and did not yet know what to do with.
The wards choose. They don't consent for you. I stopped pretending those were the same thing 2 vessels ago, and I'm not going to start pretending again for you.
He looked up at her steady.
You'll stay as my guest, not my prisoner and not my bride. If in time you decide you want something else, that will be your decision to make, not the wards, and not mine. If you never decide that, you'll still leave this house safely when it's over. I give you my word on that. for whatever a monster's word is worth to you tonight.
She had come prepared to fight a war. She had not come prepared for him to simply hand her the field.
Why does that sound like it cost you something to say?
Because it does.
He didn't elaborate. He rose, crossed to the door, and held it open for her the way a man might hold a door for anyone. Nothing performed in it.
Rhys will show you to a room. There's a lock on the inside. Use it if it helps you sleep. I mean that without irony.
Consider hitting subscribe before you go any further into this one, because where this story is going, you are absolutely not going to want to have missed the beginning when you come back for what happens next. If you're already invested, drop a like and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. The room Rhys gave her had a window that looked out over the black pines and a hearth already lit against the mountain chill, and Selah sat on the edge of the bed for a long time before she let herself lie down, listening to the house breathe around her the way old houses do, all creak and settle, nothing sinister in it once you stopped braced for the sinister to arrive. It did not arrive that night. It did not arrive the next morning either, when she woke to sunlight, actual sunlight, thin and grey but real, falling across the quilt, and a tray of bread and honey and a small clay pot of the same comfrey salve she made herself, left outside her door sometime before dawn. She stood in the doorway holding it, turning it over, trying to decide what kind of a trap looked like ordinary kindness, and concluding reluctantly that maybe it wasn't one. She explored the manor that first full day, because sitting in a locked room waiting to be summoned felt like a kind of surrender she wasn't ready to make. The east wing held a library 3 times the size of the Hollow's entire schoolhouse, shelves climbing into shadow, and she was running her fingers along a row of cracked leather spines when she heard footsteps behind her that stopped too abruptly to be casual. She turned. Rhys stood in the doorway with a lantern in one hand, and for just a moment before he mastered it, something crossed his face that made her go very still, a tightness at the jaw, a stillness in the whole of him that was not the stillness of calm.
You should go back to your room.
His voice had roughened at the edges.
Why?
Because I came up here to check the ward stones set into the west wall, and instead I found you standing in a beam of afternoon light with the smell of yarrow still on your hands from this morning, and it has been a very long time since anything in this house smelled like something worth wanting instead of something to be managed. He said it flatly, almost clinically, a man reporting a fact he did not enjoy.
I would rather tell you that honestly and ask you to leave the room than pretend it isn't true and risk startling either of us.
Selah's pulse climbed despite herself, not fear exactly, something adjacent to it that she didn't have a better name for yet.
You're asking me to leave because you're hungry.
I am asking you to leave because for 1/2 of 1 second standing here, I thought about how close you were and how quiet the house is, and that 1/2 a second frightened me more than anything has in longer than I can tell you.
He didn't move from the doorway. He didn't come closer.
So, please.
She left. She told herself, walking back down the corridor with her heart still too loud in her own ears, that the fact he'd asked instead of simply taking was supposed to reassure her, and that it was deeply unfair that it did. That night she lay awake turning the moment over, examining it from every angle the way she might examine a wound to decide how deep it truly ran. She had expected, coming into this house, that the danger would announce itself plainly, a hand closing too hard around her wrist, a door that wouldn't open from the inside no matter what he'd promised. She had not expected the danger to look like a man standing very still in a doorway, asking her to leave before he trusted himself not to cross a room he had every physical power to cross in half a heartbeat. There was something almost more unsettling in restraint offered freely than in violence that simply took what it wanted, because restraint asked something of her too. It asked her to notice it, to weigh it, to wonder against every instinct her mother had drilled into her, whether a monster who told the truth about his own hunger might be worth believing. She did not reach any conclusions that night. She only knew that when she finally slept, it was without locking the door. Holden found her 2 days later in the manor's walled garden, where the last of the summer roses had gone brown and papery at the edges. He was an old vampire in the way that showed, not in his face, which was unlined and cold as marble, but in the particular patience of his stillness, the way he watched her the way a man watches whether he intends to outlast.
You're the 4th.
The 4th what?
Chosen vessel to walk through that gate in Rhys's 3 centuries of rule. Did he tell you what happened to the other 3?
He didn't wait for her answer.
The first 2, he sent home unbound, out of some scruple about consent that has cost this coven 3 renewal cycles of failing wards. the third, he refused before she'd even unpacked her bag. The rival coven at Thornwick has been testing our borders every season since, because they can smell how thin our protection has worn. And every season Rhys tells himself that his conscience is worth more than our safety.
Holden's pale eyes didn't blink.
You should know what you're choosing to refuse, girl. It isn't only his life the wards are meant to protect.
Then why hasn't he simply forced it?
Selah kept her voice even, though something cold had settled in her stomach.
If it's that urgent.
Because he is a fool who mistook one bad century for a permanent moral position.
Holden turned to go, then paused.
Ask him about the last unbound vessel sometime. Ask him what it cost her, refusing him. See if his conscience feels quite so clean once you know the whole of it.
He left her alone among the dead roses, and she stood there a long while, turning the shape of the threat over in her mind, trying to decide how much of it was truth, and how much was a blade meant to cut her loose from whatever ground she'd found to stand on. She found Rhys in the kitchens that evening, elbow-deep in flour, and asked her plainly, because she had already learned that plain was the only currency that worked in this house.
The third vessel, what happened to her? She went home. Rhys paid for an escort, a dowry to smooth her prospects, everything he could think to give her that wasn't himself.
She resumed kneading, more force in it than the dough strictly required.
Holden's told you it cost us something. He's not wrong, precisely. Thornwick's scouts have gotten bolder every season since. But he leaves out that Rhys offered her the truth and let her choose, same as he's doing with you, and he'd do it again 100 times over rather than take what wasn't freely given. Whatever else he is, he's not a liar, and he's not the monster Holden needs him to be for Holden's arguments to hold water. Why does Holden need that?
Rhys looked up at her, something careful in her expression.
Because a coven that trusts its king doesn't need an elder telling it what the king should be doing instead. Watch him. Not me, you'll see it yourself soon enough.
If you're the kind of listener who likes to guess where a story is headed before it gets there, drop your theory in the comments right now, because what Selah's about to learn about the vessel who came before her changes everything about how you'll read the rest of this one. Selah did watch, over the days that followed, the way one watches weather, cataloguing small signs. She watched Rhys settle disputes among the household staff with a patience that cost him nothing performed and everything real. She watched him decline, 3 separate times, to simply command her presence at dinner, asking instead, and accepting her refusal each time without visible cost. She watched once from an upstairs window, as he stood at the edge of the ward line in the grey hour before dawn alone, running his hand along a stone that had begun, faintly, to crack. It was in the Manor's still room, 3 weeks into her stay, that the second near thing happened. She had gone looking for dried lavender to help an old groundskeeper's aching joints, and found Rhys there instead, cataloguing the coven's dwindling stores of the rarer healing herbs by lamplight, his sleeves pushed up, ink on his fingers from the ledger.
You keep records of medicine.
She was surprised into saying it aloud.
Someone has to. The last vessel with any training left 3 decades ago, and Edith in the village does what she can, but she's 80, and her hands shake too badly for the fine work now.
He didn't look up from the ledger.
I'm not good at it. I do it because the alternative is watching people I'm responsible for die of things that shouldn't kill them.
Selah crossed the small room to look over his shoulder at the columns of cramped handwriting, and it was only when she was close enough to read them that she registered how close she'd come, how the space between them had narrowed to something that made the air feel charged. Rhys went very still.
Selah.
Her name came out rough, strained at the edges in a way she'd only heard once before in the library.
I need you to step back. Now, please.
She looked up at him and saw it plainly this time, the tightness around his eyes, a faint tremor along his jaw. He was clearly fighting to keep from his hands, gold eyes gone a shade darker than she'd seen them. Not violence, something closer to a man holding a door shut against a storm with his whole body. She stepped back. He exhaled, a long, controlled breath that didn't need air the way hers did, and set the pen down with exaggerated care.
That's twice now.
It will keep happening as long as you're in this house. I won't pretend otherwise to make either of us more comfortable.
He met her eyes, steady despite the visible cost of it.
It changes nothing about my answer, if that's what you're asking. You can stand as close to me as you like, and my answer will still be that you get to choose. I would simply appreciate a little warning before you do it, so I can prepare instead of being caught in the middle of a ledger.
She almost laughed despite everything.
That's a strange kind of honesty.
It's the only kind I have left.
2 days later, a Thornwick scout was caught testing the ward's stones along the northern boundary. The coven's patrol brought word of it back at a dead run. A young guard named Corey, breathless, blood not his own streaked across his forearm, shouting for Rhys before he'd even cleared the courtyard gate. Behind him came 2 others, half carrying a third. Trevon, no older than 20, his face gone the colour of old ash, a blade wound opened deep along his thigh, dark and welling too fast to be anything but serious. Selah heard the commotion from her window and was down the stairs and into the courtyard with her healing kit before anyone thought to stop her.
Hold him still.
Already cutting away the ruined trouser leg, already pressing clean linen hard against the wound. She worked with the flat, unhurried competence of someone who had done this before, many times, on far worse injuries than this.
He's not going to lose the leg if someone stops arguing with me and holds him still.
Nobody argued after that. She worked for the better part of an hour by lamplight in the courtyard. Rhys crouched silently at Trevon's shoulders the whole time, offering nothing but his stillness, and once when the boy cried out, a low, wordless sound that settled him the way it might settle a spooked animal. When it was done and Trevon was carried into rest, Selah sat back on her heels in the mud, blood dried to her elbows, and found Rhys watching her with an expression she hadn't yet catalogued.
You could have let Holden's healers handle it. You didn't have to.
He's a person bleeding on the ground. I don't ask permission for that.
She wiped her hands on a clean rag, exhausted in the particular way that only comes after fear has finally been allowed to leave the body.
Is that surprising to you?
Everything about you is surprising to me.
Something in the plainness of it landed harder than a compliment dressed up in finer clothes would have. That was the night Rhys found her afterward, sitting alone by the kitchen fire, and told her, unprompted, the shape of what Rhys had refused to say himself. 2 chosen vessels before the third. Before the one Selah had already heard about, there had been a woman, decades before Rhys's own turning, who the wards had chosen when Rhys was young in his rule, and desperate to prove himself worthy of it. He had taken the binding before he understood what taking it without her full willingness would cost her. She had lived, technically. She had also never forgiven him, and had spent what remained of her mortal life at the far edge of his territory, refusing to so much as look at him when their paths crossed at festival gatherings.
That's the century he stopped counting. That's what Holden won't say out loud, because it doesn't serve his argument. Rhys isn't refusing out of some abstract principle. He's refusing because he already knows exactly what it costs a person, being claimed instead of chosen. He watched it happen. He caused it happening.
She stared into the fire.
He would rather lose the wards entirely than do that again, even to save the coven, even to save himself.
What was her name? The woman?
He's never said it aloud in front of me. Not once, in all the decades I've served him.
Rhys turned a poker slowly through the coals, watching sparks lift and die.
I don't think it's because he's forgotten it. I think it's the opposite. I think he's afraid that if he says it out loud, he'll start believing he's allowed to be forgiven for it, and some part of him has decided he isn't, not ever, no matter how many centuries he spends trying to be the kind of king who wouldn't do it again.
She set the poker aside.
He's harder on himself than Holden could ever manage to be on him. That's the part Holden's never understood, in all his complaining about a king too soft for the crown. Rhys isn't soft. He's just decided that being right is worth less to him than being kind, and he'd rather this coven resent him for that than watch one more woman pay for his certainty.
Selah thought of the tremor she'd seen in his hands, twice now in the library and in the still room, the visible cost of a restraint he offered so plainly and never once made her feel indebted for.
That's not softness. That's just a harder kind of strength than the one Holden respects.
She said it half to herself. Rhys looked at her then, something unreadable passing behind her dark eyes.
You're starting to sound like you're on his side of this, apothecary.
I'm on my own side of this.
Even to her own ears it came out less certain than she meant it to.
I just don't think those 2 things are as far apart as I assumed they'd be, walking through that gate 3 weeks ago.
Selah sat with that for a long while after Rhys had gone to bed, turning it over, feeling the shape of the story rearrange something in her chest that she wasn't ready yet to name. She found him the next evening at the ward line again, in the grey hour, watching the crack in the stone spread another finger's width since she'd last looked. Coming to stand beside him without asking permission this time, she felt him notice it, felt the small controlled breath it cost him.
Why are you really waiting? Not the version you gave me on the first night, the real one.
He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer.
Because the wards were never meant to bind an unwilling woman to a reluctant man for the sake of a war. They were meant to bind two people who chose each other. And somewhere in the last several centuries, the coven decided that was too slow and too uncertain a mechanism to trust, so they built a shortcut instead. A war that stands because a woman had no better option than to let it. I have watched what that shortcut does to a person up close. I am not willing to build another wall out of you, Selah, no matter what it costs the rest of us if it falls.
He looked at her, and there was nothing performed in his face at all.
So, even knowing everything, now my answer is still yours to give, not mine to take. Or do you choose?
Selah looked at the crack running through 300 years of stone, and thought of the boy Trevon healing upstairs, and the desperate, exhausted patience of a man who catalogued herbs by lamplight because no one else would, and the shape of a refusal she had walked into this house already certain of.
No.
It cost her something to say it this time, in a way it hadn't the first night.
Not because I don't.
She stopped, chose the words more carefully.
Not because there's nothing here worth choosing. Because I want to be sure it's a choice and not a slower version of the same trap. I need more time than the wards are giving either of us.
Something in his face eased very slightly at that, not disappointment, or not only disappointment, something closer to relief that she had told him the truth instead of a kinder lie.
Then you have it, for as long as the stone holds.
Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the stone was not going to hold much longer. Share this one with anyone you know who's still waiting on a slow-burn romance to actually earn its ending, because the next stretch of this story is exactly what you've been waiting for, and you will want someone to talk about it with when it's over. The assault came 4 nights later, in full dark, without warning beyond a single low-horn blast from the watchtower that had every guard in the manor moving before Selah was fully out of bed. She heard it from her window first, the crack of the outer ward finally giving way entire, a sound like a great tree splitting, and then the screaming started from the direction of the village below. She was down the stairs and pulling on her boots before she'd fully decided to go, her healing kit already in hand, some old stubborn instinct from a life of tending wounds, refusing to let her sit locked safely in a room while people bled somewhere she could reach them. Rhys caught her at the courtyard gate, face grim in the torchlight, already armed, a guard named Taj falling into step behind her with a blade drawn.
Thornwick, they've been waiting for the wards to fail since the season turned. Stay behind the line. Do you hear me? Stay.
Whatever else Rhys meant to say was lost as 3 shapes came vaulting over the broken outer wall at once, and the courtyard dissolved into motion. Selah pressed herself against the gatepost as Taj met the first attacker blade to blade, sparks striking off steel in the dark, and somewhere above them on the watchtower the horn sounded a second time, longer, more desperate than the first. She went down into the village anyway, because the wounded were down there and not up here, slipping through a gap in the wall while Rhys's attention was elsewhere, telling herself she would regret the decision later and telling herself, in the same breath, that she had never once in her life been able to walk past someone bleeding simply because walking toward them was dangerous. The lower streets were chaos, doors flung open, a haycart burning somewhere past the smithy throwing wild orange light across running figures. She couldn't tell friend from stranger in the dark. She found a woman named Dina crouched over her husband in the mud outside the mill, pressing a torn apron to a gash along his ribs, and Selah dropped to her knees beside them without a word, hands already moving, years of training taking over where thought had stopped being useful. She worked fast and rough by the light of the burning cart, packing the wound, tying it off, moving to the next body and the next. The training her mother had drilled into her, the only thing standing between her and the particular kind of paralysis that comes from too much blood in too little light. It was perhaps 20 minutes into that grim mechanical rhythm, some closer to hours, in the way fear stretches time thin, that she heard a child's thin scream from the direction of the well, high and raw, cutting clean through the general roar of the night, and she did not think. She only ran. The girl was maybe 6 years old, Edith the healer's granddaughter, small and barefoot in the mud, frozen in the open square as a Thornwick scout advanced on her with a blade already dark to the hilt. Somewhere behind the child, old Edith herself was struggling upright from where she'd fallen, one hand outstretched, too far away and too slow to reach her granddaughter before the blade did. Selah did not have time to think about what she was doing, did not weigh the odds the way years of careful, deliberate healing had trained her to weigh everything else. She simply moved, closing the last few strides between herself and the child, throwing her own body between the girl and the descending blade. The edge caught her along the side, low beneath the ribs, a long burning line that didn't hurt yet the way she somehow knew it would in a moment, the particular cruel mercy of a bad wound announcing itself in shock before it announced itself in pain. She heard herself gasp. She heard the child scream again, this time in terror at the blood rather than her own danger, and she was already stumbling, already going down onto one knee in the mud with the girl clutched instinctively against her chest, when something moved through the dark faster than her eyes could track. There was a sound she would never fully be able to describe afterward, not quite a roar, not quite a word, something older than either, and then the scout was simply gone, torn away into the dark with a violence that left no time for her to see the whole of it, only the aftermath. Rhys standing where the man had been, blood on his hands that wasn't his own, his eyes burned down to something molten and terrible that softened, the instant he turned and saw her on the ground into raw, naked fear.
Selah.
He was at her side before the name finished leaving his mouth, hands hovering over the wound, not yet touching, as if touching it might make it more real.
Selah, look at me.
The world was going very quiet and very far away at the edges. She was aware, distantly, of the child being pulled gently from her arms by someone else, of Edith's voice somewhere close and cracking with grief and relief both at once, of being lifted, of the cold night air giving way to the warmer dark of the manor, carried faster than any human legs could have carried her. She was aware, distantly, of being carried. Of Rhys's voice, stripped down to something raw, and frightened that she had never heard from him before, saying her name over and over like a man trying to hold a door shut with his voice alone. She was aware of the manor's stillroom, of lamplight, of Rhys's hands pressing linen against her side, with the same brutal competence Selah had used on Trevon 3 nights before, and of the particular terrible calculation in the room, the wound too deep, the blood loss too fast, the mortal machinery of her body simply not equipped to outrun what had been done to it.
Rhys.
Her voice was tight and low.
She doesn't have time for a physician from the village. You know what this is.
I know what it is.
His voice, when it came, was a stranger's voice, stripped of every careful, patient thing she'd come to know in it.
I know exactly what it is.
Selah, floating somewhere at the edge of consciousness, felt his hand close around hers, felt it shaking, actually shaking, for the first time since she'd met him, the tremor he'd always fought so hard to keep from showing finally breaking loose entirely. Very quietly, close to her ear, she heard him speak. I asked you, I promised you I would always ask. I am asking you now, and I need you to hear me, because if you say no, I will honor it and you will die honoring it, and I need you to understand that before you answer. Selah, can you hear me? She could. Some small, fierce, still conscious part of her understood exactly what was being offered and exactly what it would cost either way, and found, in the burning wreckage of her own fear, that the answer had already been sitting inside her for longer than she'd let herself admit.
Yes.
It came out as barely more than breath.
Rhys, yes.
What she remembered afterward came in fragments, disordered, half-lit, the way memory sometimes preserves only the parts the body decided were important enough to keep. She remembered Rhys's hands leaving the wound at her side, stepping back to give him room, the particular hush that fell over the still room the moment he lowered himself beside the bed. She remembered the brief, shocking cold of his mouth at her throat, gentler than she would ever have imagined a desperate man capable of being, careful in a way that felt like its own kind of apology offered without words. And then warmth, flooding through her like something breaking open, like a door finally swinging wide after 300 years shut against a storm, spreading out from that single point of contact until it reached even her fingertips, until the burning line at her side began, impossibly, to cool. She remembered his hands shaking against her skin the entire time, not with hunger, or not only with hunger, but with something closer to terror, the particular, specific terror of a man performing the one act he had sworn to himself, across 3 centuries and 2 refused vessels, and one wound he had never let himself stop paying for, that he would never again allow himself to take without absolute certainty it was freely given. She felt dimly the war being fought in every line of him, restraint and need and grief tangled together into something that shook harder than either alone would have. He drew back before she expected him to, before her own fading strength would have known to ask him to stop, and pressed his forehead briefly to her uninjured shoulder, a single ragged breath escaping him that sounded less like satisfaction than like a man who had just stepped back from a ledge he'd been certain, for one terrible moment, he would not survive stepping away from. Very low, very rough, though whether he meant it as instruction or plea she couldn't have said even then, she heard him speak.
Stay with me, Selah. Stay.
She did. She woke to grey morning light, and the ache of a wound already knitting faster than any wound had a right to, and a low, unfamiliar hum settled somewhere behind her ribs, like a second heartbeat that wasn't hers, and had never asked her permission to move in. Rhys was in the chair beside the bed, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, entirely undone, hollow-eyed, his hands still faintly unsteady where they rested on his knees, watching her the way a man watches something he is bracing to lose all over again.
You saved my life.
Her voice came out rougher than she expected.
I took something from you to do it.
He didn't try to soften it.
You said yes, and I will hold on to that until the day I stop existing. But you said it dying, Selah, with a blade in your side and no time to think it through the way either of us would have wanted, and I need you to be angry about that, if you need to be. I won't pretend it was the clean thing I swore I'd never do to anyone else. It wasn't. It was the only thing. And there's a difference, but I understand if that difference doesn't feel like enough this morning.
Selah lay there, feeling the unfamiliar hum of the band move under her skin, feeling the ghost of his fear still caught in the room like smoke that hadn't cleared, and found, to her own surprise, that what rose up in her chest wasn't fury. It was something far more complicated, something she didn't have the strength yet this morning to sort all the way through. Before she could try, the door opened without a knock, and Holden stood in the frame, flanked by two of the coven's older guards, his pale eyes moving from Selah's bandaged side to the visible, unmistakable mark now healing at her throat, and something in his cold, patient face finally, terribly satisfied.
There it is. The King of Ashmere, breaking the very vow that's made him unfit to rule this coven for 3 centuries, the moment his own restraint became inconvenient to him.
He let that land in the silence that followed.
The council will want to hear how a man too weak to control himself under pressure intends to keep leading us through a war Thornwick has just formally begun.
He inclined his head, almost courteous.
I'll leave you to explain yourself, Your Majesty. You have until the council convenes at dusk.
If you want to see whether Holden's challenge actually succeeds, and what Selah decides to do with a bond she never fully consented to, but can no longer pretend she doesn't want, hit subscribe now so you don't miss it, and drop a comment telling me who you're rooting for in this fight, because episode 2 is coming and it does not slow down from here. The door closed behind him, and the manor fell into a silence that felt, for the first time since Selah had arrived, genuinely dangerous, not to her, not anymore, but to the fragile, unfinished thing sitting unspoken between the two of them in that room. Rhys rose from the chair slowly, crossed to the window, and stood looking out at the black pines and the broken ward stones beyond them, his shoulders carrying a weight Selah had not seen on him even on the worst of the nights before this one. Not turning around, he spoke quietly.
He's not wrong that this will be used against me. He's also not entirely wrong about what it means. I broke a vow I made to myself a very long time ago. I would make the same choice again in the same second, and it still cost something real, and I won't pretend to you that it didn't.
Selah pushed herself carefully upright against the pillows, testing the pull of the healing wound, feeling the strange new hum beneath her skin settle a fraction as if it recognized, somehow, that she was choosing to sit up and face this rather than lie back down inside her own fear.
Then let me tell you what I choose now. With a clear head, in daylight, no blade in my side and nobody's life hanging on the answer.
She held his gaze when he finally turned from the window.
I asked for time because I didn't want a choice made for me by a wall that was going to fall whether I liked it or not. The wall fell. I'm still choosing.
Her voice caught just slightly, and she let it.
I'm not finished being angry about how it happened. I don't think I will be for a while yet. But I'm not running from what's sitting under my skin right now, and I'm not going to let Holden decide what it means before I've had the chance to decide for myself.
Rhys crossed the room slowly, the way he had crossed every room since the first night, careful of the distance, waiting for her to close what remained of it if she chose to. She did. She reached for his hand, felt the tremor still faintly there beneath the calm he was working hard to hold, and did not let go.
300 years, and you waited for someone to actually mean it.
I'd have waited 300 more rather than take it any other way.
Outside, the horn sounded again from the watchtower, low and steady this time, the signal that called the coven to council, and somewhere below them in the great hall, Holden was already gathering the votes that would decide whether the king of Ashmere kept his crown past sundown. Selah tightened her grip on Rhys's hand, and felt, for the first time since the wards had chosen her weeks ago, not like a vessel being claimed by an old spell, but like a woman about to walk into a fight she had, finally, chosen for herself. The great hall was fuller than Selah had ever seen it, elders and guards alike crowded along the old stone walls, torchlight throwing restless shadows across faces that had, until tonight, mostly regarded her with polite, distant curiosity. Holden stood at the head of the long table with the easy confidence of a man who believed the outcome already decided, two of the eldest coven members flanking him like a verdict waiting to be read aloud. Before Rhys had even fully crossed the threshold, Holden began.
3 centuries this coven has watched its king refuse the one obligation that keeps every soul in this hall alive. 3 centuries of scruples we could not afford. And now Thornwick scouts walk our broken wards at will, and a child nearly died in our own square because the man meant to protect her was too busy protecting his conscience.
His pale eyes swept the room, gathering agreement the way a net gathers water, patient and thorough.
He broke that vow only when it became convenient. I ask this council plainly, what is a king's word worth if it bends the moment it costs him something?
A murmur ran through the gathered coven, low and uncertain, the sound of people who had loved their king out of habit for 300 years now being asked to weigh that habit against fear. Selah felt Rhys's hand tighten fractionally around hers, and understood in that instant that he intended to let the accusation stand unanswered, that some old, stubborn part of him believed he deserved whatever judgment this room chose to hand down. She was not willing to let him do that. She stepped forward before she'd fully decided to, out of the shelter of his shoulder, and into the torchlight where the whole hall could see the healing wound at her throat plainly, and let the silence that followed do some of the work before she spoke into it.
I was in that square.
Her voice, to her own surprise, did not shake.
I chose to stand between that scout and a 6-year-old girl before anyone in this hall had decided anything on my behalf. Nobody's vow made that choice for me. I made it, the same way I've made every choice since I walked through your gates weeks ago, because your king has spent every single day since then asking me instead of telling me, even when asking cost him plainly, even when I know now exactly how much it cost him.
She turned, slow and deliberate, to face Holden directly.
You want to stand there and call him weak for finally choosing to save my life over keeping a promise to himself. I call that the only kind of king worth this coven's loyalty. If you want to vote tonight, Elder, take it. But you'll take it knowing that the woman he supposedly wronged is standing here telling you, in front of every soul in this hall, that I chose this. All of it. Even the parts that still hurt.
The hall had gone very still. Holden's composure did not crack outright, but something in it thinned visibly, the certainty he'd worn coming into the room no longer quite so absolute.
Sentiment is not the same as strategy. Thornwick will not care how the wards were renewed, only that they were, and how quickly.
Speaking for the first time since entering the hall, his voice carrying the particular quiet authority Selah had learned over these last weeks, meant he had already decided something and would not be moved from it, Rhys answered.
Then let the wards answer that. Walk the boundary at dawn, Holden. All of you. See for yourselves whether they begun to mend, or whether I have cost this coven what you claim I have.
Nobody moved to argue that. The council bell, still hanging heavy in the rafters overhead, had not finished its final low note when the first elder near the door inclined her head, slow and grudging, and one by one the rest of the hall followed, until even Holden was left standing alone at the head of the table with nothing left to gather but his own thinning patience. He did not concede. He only watched Selah with his cold, patient eyes, the look of a man recalculating rather than surrendering. He said it quiet enough that only those nearest him could hear it.
Dawn then. We'll see what the stone says.
He inclined his head to Rhys with icy, exact courtesy, and left the hall without another word, his silence somehow louder than anything he might have shouted. Selah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, and felt Rhys's hand find hers again in the settling quiet, steadier now than it had been all night.
That wasn't over. Whatever he just walked out of that room deciding, it wasn't a surrender.
No, it wasn't.
He looked toward the tall windows at the far end of the hall, where the first grey edge of dawn had just begun to touch the black pines beyond the broken wall.
But the stone will tell its own truth in a few hours, and for the first time in 3 centuries, I am not afraid of what it's going to say.
Selah followed his gaze out toward the ward line, toward the crack that had run through 300 years of failing stone, and toward whatever waited for both of them once the sun came fully up over Ashmere Hollow.
Then let's go find out together.
Neither of them moved yet. Outside, the horn on the watchtower fell silent at last, and somewhere far beyond the broken wall, in the dark heart of the Thornwick Wood, something was already watching the mended light begin to rise. Selah did not know yet what the coming days would ask of either of them. Whether the wards would hold long enough for a bond neither of them had chosen cleanly to become one they'd choose again with clear eyes, or whether Holden's cold, patient calculation was already reaching towards some second move neither of them could see coming yet. She knew only that the hand in hers had stopped shaking somewhere in the last hour, that the low hum beneath her own skin had settled into something that felt less like an intrusion now, and more like a second pulse she was slowly, cautiously learning to trust. 300 years he had waited for someone to mean it. She had meant it dying in the mud with no time left to weigh the cost properly, and she intended whatever came next to go on meaning it now that she finally had the daylight to choose it clearly. The sun cleared the black pines fully as they stood together at the tall windows, and for the first time since she had walked through the coven's gates weeks ago, Selah watched the light reach all the way to the broken ward line without flinching from what it might reveal. Holden walked the boundary at dawn exactly as he had promised the council he would, and for the length of 300 paces, he found what he had least wanted to find. The crack that had run the length of the northern wall since midsummer had closed almost to a hairline, pale new stone knitting itself, shut the way a wound knits when the body finally stops fighting its own healing. He pressed 2 fingers to the mended seam and felt warmth there, faint but unmistakable, the particular warmth of a working bond rather than a broken one. He had expected to find failure. He found, instead, the one thing that could undo every argument he had spent 3 centuries building. And then, 6 paces further on, crouched at the base of a stone that had not yet finished closing, he found something else, a flaw in the mending, subtle enough that only a vampire who had studied ward law for 300 years would have recognized it for what it was. He knelt in the frost a long time, turning the flaw over in his patient, calculating mind, and when he finally rose, he was smiling. News of the mended wards reached the manor before Holden did, carried up the mountain road by a village boy paid a copper coin for his speed, and by the time Selah came down to breakfast, the household staff had already sorted themselves into 2 unmistakable camps. The kitchen maids who had watched her stitch Trevon's leg by lamplight greeted her with the easy warmth of people who had decided, sometime in the last several days, that she belonged among them. The older guards loyal to Holden's faction watched her from doorways with something closer to suspicion, as if the healing mark at her throat made her not a healer at all anymore, but a weapon aimed at the coven's stability. She felt the divide the moment she crossed the threshold of the great hall, a silence that hadn't been there 3 days ago, and understood with a small sinking clarity that the council vote had not settled anything. It had only made the disagreement visible. She found Trevon in the courtyard that same morning, testing weight on his healing leg with the careful, stubborn determination of a young guard eager to prove himself fit for duty again, and he fell into step beside her without being asked, matching her pace despite the visible effort it cost him. "They're saying things about you in the barracks," he said without preamble, the bluntness of youth overriding whatever discretion an older guard might have exercised. "Some of the men. Not the ones who saw you save my leg, the others."
What kind of things?
"That the binding wasn't done right, that it makes you dangerous somehow or makes him dangerous. I couldn't quite follow the logic of it." Trevon shrugged, wincing slightly at the movement. "I told them they were fools who'd have bled out on that cobblestone if you hadn't been the one kneeling over them instead of standing around arguing about whether it was proper for you to help." He glanced at her sideways. "I don't know much about coven law. I know you saved my leg with your own 2 hands while everyone else was still deciding whether that was allowed. That seems like the only proof I need." Selah felt something loosen slightly in her chest at that, small and unexpected, the particular relief of being trusted by someone with nothing to gain from trusting her.
Thank you, Trevon.
Wasn't flattery, was just true. He nodded once decisively, the way young men do when they've said something they mean and don't want to make a fuss of it, and peeled off toward the barracks, leaving her to cross the rest of the courtyard alone with that small, steady warmth still settled against the morning's uncertainty. Rhys found her there, standing very still amid a room gone quiet around her, and crossed to her side without hesitation, a small public gesture that cost him something in front of the watching guards, and that he made anyway.
They'll come around, some of them faster than others.
And the ones who don't.
Then they'll have to decide whether loyalty to this coven means anything without loyalty to the choices its king makes when it matters.
He didn't sound worried exactly. He sounded like a man who had made peace, a long time ago, with the cost of being disliked for the right reasons.
Holden's walking the boundary this morning. We'll know soon enough what story he decides to tell about what he finds there.
They did not have to wait long. Holden returned before midday, and the council he summoned was smaller and colder than the 3 nights before. No crowd along the walls this time. Only the coven's senior elders gathered around the long table, Rhys and Selah standing together at its foot like defendants rather than sovereigns. Holden laid a single dark stone on the table's surface, no larger than a fist, its surface threaded through with a hairline crack of pale, unhealed light.
The boundary is mending.
There was no triumph in his voice this time, which frightened Selah more than triumph would have.
I will not stand here and pretend otherwise, but a binding renewed under duress without the full and willing exchange the old law requires does not mend cleanly. It mends flawed.
He tapped the stone.
This fragment came from the northern wall, from the exact section closest to where the bite was taken. Every other stone along that boundary has closed entire. This one has not, and will not, because the exchange that sealed it was incomplete.
Consider hitting subscribe before this next part, because episode 2 is where the real fight begins, and you are not going to want to have missed a single piece of what got broken to get here. Like the video if you're already leaning forward, and tell me in the comments whether you think Holden's telling the truth about that stone.
Incomplete how?
His voice was even, but Selah, standing close enough to feel the tension in his arm, heard the effort that evenness cost him.
You know the old law as well as I do.
Holden's pale eyes moved from Rhys to Selah and back.
A binding sealed to save a dying vessel's life is valid. The law has always allowed for that mercy. But it is only fully valid, fully proof against a challenge, if both parties complete the second exchange once the immediate danger has passed. A choosing made freely, in safety, to match the choosing made in crisis.
He let the silence stretch.
You have not done that. 3 days since the assault and you have not done that. Which means, by the letter of law, this coven has followed for longer than either of you has existed. The binding remains technically incomplete, vulnerable to challenge, vulnerable to being severed by any elder withstanding to bring the matter before the full council.
He inclined his head, almost gently.
I am not your enemy in saying this. I am telling you what any rival coven's law reader will find the instant they go looking, and Thornwick, I promise you, is already looking.
The elders around the table exchanged glances. Selah couldn't fully read old alliances and old grudges moving beneath the surface of expressions schooled carefully blank. Rhys, standing near the door, had gone very still in the particular way Selah had learned, meant she was doing careful, furious math behind an unreadable face.
Then we complete it.
Before anyone else could speak, she felt the whole room's attention swing toward her like a struck bell. Holden's brows lifted, the first genuine surprise she had seen cross his composed face.
You would choose that, now, with the whole council watching and Thornwick's envoys already on the mountain road.
I chose it 3 days ago, bleeding in the mud, with a lot less certainty than I have standing here right now.
She held his gaze steady and felt Rhys's attention on her like heat.
You wanted proof this wasn't taken from me under duress that I've since regretted. Fine. I'm telling you plainly, in front of your whole council, that I don't regret it, and I'm not interested in performing regret to make your lore reading tidier.
She turned to Rhys.
We'll do it the way the law requires, in safety. Chosen, not survived. Is that what you want too?
Something moved across his face that she had only seen once before, in the study on the very first night, not amusement this time, but something closer to disbelief that had run all the way through and come out the other side as quiet, astonished gratitude.
It is exactly what I want. It has been what I wanted since long before I had any right to say so.
Holden's composure held, but something behind his eyes recalculated, visibly, the way it had in the Great Hall 3 nights before.
Then do it soon, because Thornwick's envoy arrives within the week, and a coven that looks divided to outsiders is a coven that gets tested, regardless of what its internal law eventually decides.
He gathered the dark stone back into his palm. The council dispersed in 2s and 3s, murmuring, and Selah found herself alone with Rhys in the emptying hall, the weight of what she had just said aloud in front of strangers settling into her chest, like something both frightening and, unexpectedly, steady.
You didn't have to answer him that fast.
I know.
She looked up at him.
I didn't want to think about it any longer than I already have. I've had 3 days of lying awake feeling this bond settle into me, and every single time I asked myself honestly whether I regretted it, the answer was the same. I just hadn't said it out loud yet where it counted.
They walked together out to the covered gallery overlooking the mending northern wall, neither quite ready to return to the separate business of the day, and for a long moment neither spoke, the morning cold and clean around them.
Can I ask you something, and have you actually answer it, instead of giving me the careful diplomat's version you gave the council?
Always.
When Holden said the exchange was incomplete, before I answered him, what did you feel, honestly?
She watched his face carefully.
Relief that there was still a door open, in case I wanted to walk through it later on my own terms, or something else.
Rhys was quiet long enough that she thought, for a moment, he might retreat into the same careful composure he wore for councils. Then he let out a breath that carried more weight than the question alone seemed to deserve.
Dread. Pure, unguarded dread, the kind I haven't let myself feel in front of anyone in longer than I can easily count, because some old, frightened part of me has spent 3 days waiting for you to realize you'd had a choice made for you, by circumstance, and to want, quietly and reasonably, to let the incomplete exchange stand as an exit rather than a formality.
He met her eyes.
I would have let you take it if that was what you wanted. I want you to know that plainly. But I have not, in 3 centuries, wanted anything the way I wanted you to choose to stay.
Selah felt something in her chest ease at the honesty of it, the same way it had eased, weeks ago, the first time he told her the truth about his own hunger instead of a kinder lie.
I want you to hear me say the rest of it too, not because Holden's forcing the timeline, but because it's true regardless of what he does with his stone and his lore eating. I want this. I want you. I've wanted it for longer than I was ready to admit even to myself, and I'm done being careful about saying so.
Rhys reached for her hand, and this time there was no tremor in his grip at all, only a steadiness that felt to Selah like the first entirely uncomplicated thing that had passed between them since the wards first chose her name.
Then we'll do this right. No blade in your side, no council clock ticking behind us, just the 2 of us choosing it in the daylight, the way it was always supposed to happen.
They did not get the luxury of unhurried time. Thornwick's envoy arrived 4 days later instead of a week, 3 riders in dark grey livery bearing a banner Selah didn't recognize, and their arrival threw the manor into a different kind of tension than council politics, the particular watchful courtesy that covens extend to rivals testing for weakness. The envoy's leader, a sharp-eyed vampire lord named Corin Vale, made a great and visible show of admiring the manor's mended walls, while asking pointed questions about the coven's recent, well-publicized council dispute, and Selah understood within the first hour of the visit that every word exchanged in that formal reception hall was a probe searching for the exact fracture Holden's technicality had been built to exploit. Corin Vale was elegant in the particular, deliberate way of a man who had built his whole reputation on being underestimated, soft-spoken and quick to smile, his questions wrapped in enough courtesy that only afterward did their sharp edges become obvious. He complimented the wine. He complimented the mended stonework along the eastern approach, remarking, almost idly, that it was remarkable how quickly a binding could mend once a coven found the proper motivation, and let his pale eyes rest on Selah just a beat too long for the comment to have been entirely idle. She held his gaze without flinching, because she had already learned, watching Holden work a room for 2 weeks, exactly what that particular kind of testing silence was meant to accomplish.
You seem very settled here for a woman only weeks into her binding.
His tone was light and conversational over the second course, in a way that fooled no one at the table.
I grew up tending wounds nobody else wanted to touch. I've never had much patience for pretending to be uncertain about a decision once I've actually made it. It wastes time better spent doing something useful.
Something flickered behind Corin's polished courtesy, not quite respect, not yet, but the recalibration of a man who had come expecting an easy target and was quietly revising that estimate. Rhys, seated further down the table, caught Selah's eye for half a second, the barest approving nod passing between them before both returned their attention to the performance of hospitality still playing out across the long table. Later, once the formal courtesies of the evening had wound down and the envoy's party had retired to their guest quarters, Rhys found Selah in the corridor outside the great hall and fell into step beside her, voice low.
Veils sharper than most envoys Thornwick sent us before. He's not here to insult us into a mistake. He's here to measure exactly how much weight this coven can bear before it cracks and report back precisely. Every question he asked tonight had a purpose behind it.
I noticed.
She glanced back toward the closed doors of the guest wing.
He asked about the council dispute twice, in two different ways, like he was hoping one of us would answer differently the second time.
That's exactly what he was hoping.
Rhys's mouth curved, not quite a smile.
You didn't give him the opening. That matters more than you probably realize. A coven that answers the same both times looks steady. A coven that answers differently looks like exactly the kind of fracture worth exploiting.
She studied Selah for a moment, something almost warm in her usually guarded expression.
You're better at this than you give yourself credit for.
I'm not doing anything except telling the truth plainly. It's the only strategy I actually know how to execute on purpose.
In this house, that turns out to be a rarer skill than swordsmanship.
She spent the evenings of that tense week doing the only thing that had ever made her feel useful in a world too large and political for her taste. She went to the household staff and the lower guards, the same people who had watched her stitch Trevon's leg and pack wounds by firelight, and she simply talked to them, plainly. The way she'd learned plain was the only currency that worked in this house. She sat in the kitchens with the maids and answered their questions about the bond honestly, without performance. She checked on Trevon's healing leg and let him talk through his fear about Thornwick's envoy while she worked. She found, without quite meaning to build one, that a kind of loyalty was forming around her that had nothing to do with the coven's old law of fear, and everything to do with a woman who had knelt in the mud beside strangers and stayed. One evening, sitting with a handful of the younger guards over bowls of stew in the lower hall, one of them, a broad-shouldered young man named Freddie, barely older than Trevon, asked her plainly what the older guards had apparently been too proud to ask directly. "Is it true the bond lets you feel what he feels?" Freddie asked, then reddened slightly at his own bluntness. "Sorry. Only some of the older ones say it's a kind of chain. Others say it's the opposite." Nobody agrees, and you're the only person in this house who'd actually know. Selah considered the question honestly, turning her spoon slowly through her stew while she found the right words.
It's not a chain. Chains pull one direction. This pulls both ways, or it isn't working the way it's meant to. I feel him sometimes, at the edges, worry mostly, and a kind of tiredness he doesn't let anyone see. I don't think that's a cage. I think that's just what it means to actually let someone in, whether they've got fangs or not.
Freddie nodded slowly, turning that over, and something in the easy, unguarded way the rest of the table absorbed her answer told Selah that whatever quiet campaign Holden had been running to paint her as a liability was losing ground, one honest conversation at a time. Rhys told her this one evening, watching from the kitchen doorway as Selah wrapped a burn on a young stable hand's palm.
They trust you because you never asked them to. That's rarer in this house than you'd think.
It's not a strategy. I just don't know how to walk past someone hurting.
She thought of her mother's voice again, the same steady lesson repeated so many times over so many years it had worn itself into instinct rather than choice.
I was raised by a woman who believed usefulness was its own kind of courage. I didn't come to this house looking to build loyalty. I just kept doing the only thing I've ever known how to do, and apparently that turned out to matter to people in ways I hadn't expected.
I know.
Rhys's expression was careful. I need you to know something else then, because I think it matters more than either of us wants it to. She glanced down the corridor to be sure they were alone, then drew Selah into the empty pantry beyond the kitchen, closing the door behind them with the deliberate quiet of someone who had rehearsed this conversation more than once before finally deciding to have it.
I've been watching the ledgers Holden keeps for the Northern Watch rotation. 3 separate nights in the last 2 months, he's had guards pulled from the boundary he claims to care so much about protecting. Always on nights, a Thornwick scout was later confirmed testing that exact stretch of wall.
She let that sit.
I don't have proof he's been in direct contact with them. Not yet. But I don't believe in coincidence that convenient, 3 times running, from a man who spent 3 centuries claiming our safety is the only thing he cares about.
Selah felt something cold settle low in her stomach.
You think he's the reason the wards kept failing before I ever arrived?
I think that a man who benefits from a coven perpetually one crisis away from needing him to be right about everything has a great deal of incentive to keep manufacturing crises.
She straightened.
I'm going to keep looking, quietly. Say nothing to Rhys until I have something solid enough to survive Holden calling it slander, because right now it's only a pattern, and patterns aren't proof.
Why tell me and not him?
Rhys hesitated, and for the first time since Selah had known her, something like uncertainty crossed the captain's usually unreadable face.
Because Rhys has spent 3 centuries trying to be fair to a man who's never once been fair back. And I think some part of him would rather believe Holden's simply wrong than believe he's been actively working against everything Rhys has spent his rule trying to build. You don't carry that history. You'll look at the evidence plainly, without 300 years of wanting to believe better of him getting in the way.
She met Selah's eyes.
I need someone in this house who can see this clearly. I think that's you.
Selah turned that over for a moment, feeling the particular weight of being trusted with something this dangerous by a woman who trusted almost no one easily.
You could have carried this alone, kept investigating quietly, and brought it straight to the council once you had enough.
I could have.
Rhys's expression didn't soften exactly, but something in it settled.
I decided I'd rather have someone else in this house who could recognize the shape of what I was building before I finished building it, in case something happened to me before I got the chance to bring it forward myself. That's not distrust of my own judgment. That's just what it means to actually trust someone, whether they've got a captain's rank or not.
Selah kept the secret exactly as long as it took to find herself alone in the walled garden 3 evenings later, and Holden's cold, patient voice at her back before she'd even heard him approach. You've been busy making friends among my staff.
They're not your staff. They're the coven staff, and last I checked, you don't get to own people's loyalty just because you frighten them into silence about it.
She turned to face him, refusing to let him have her back as a target.
I know what you're doing, Holden. Manufacturing just enough instability to make your argument about a weak king look prophetic instead of self-serving.
Something flickered behind his cold eyes, not guilt, she thought, but something closer to genuine surprise that she'd said it plainly rather than dancing around it.
You think I want this coven to fall to Thornwick?
I think you want this coven to need you badly enough that it stops asking whether 300 years of loyalty to Rhys means more than your version of what's safe.
She held his gaze.
I've watched you work a room for 2 weeks now. You don't argue like a man who's afraid of losing. You argue like a man who's afraid of becoming irrelevant, and those aren't the same fear, and I don't think they deserve the same respect.
For a long moment, Holden said nothing at all, and something in his marble stillness cracked just slightly, not into anger, but into something colder and more calculating than she had seen from him yet. Do you know what it is to watch a boy you helped raise into a king make the same soft, sentimental mistake his predecessor made, and know exactly how it ends because you were there the first time? His voice had dropped, quieter now and stranger for its quiet.
I do not build my arguments out of ambition, girl, whatever you'd like to believe about me. I built them out of watching 3 centuries of good intentions get people killed. You call it manufacturing instability. I call it refusing to let comfortable sentiment blind this coven to the same danger twice.
Then why lie about it? If you truly believe you're right, why not make that argument honestly instead of engineering the crises that prove it?
Something in his expression shuttered closed again, the brief unguarded honesty retreating back behind 3 centuries of practiced composure.
Careful, girl. You've earned yourself some warmth in these halls this week. Don't mistake that for standing enough to speak to me this way twice.
If you're enjoying watching Selah hold her ground against a 300-year-old political operator, drop a comment telling me what you think Holden's actually after, because the next chapter is where his real plan finally shows its teeth, and I promise you it is not what anyone in that garden was expecting. He left her among the dead roses again, and this time she stood there a long while, not frightened, exactly, but certain, in a way she hadn't been before, that whatever came next from Holden would not be another council speech. It came 3 nights later, at a coven gathering meant to smooth over Thornwick's visit with a show of unified strength. A formal dinner in the great hall, elders and envoy alike seated at the long table under torchlight, wine poured from the coven's oldest cellar stock as a gesture of hospitality and confidence both. Selah sat at Rhys's right hand for the first time in any formal setting, and felt the weight of the envoy's watching eyes cataloguing every detail of the coven's supposed fracture and finding, to her quiet satisfaction, considerably less fracture than they'd expected to find. It was midway through the second course that Rhys went still beside her in a way that had nothing to do with vampire stillness, and everything to do with a man whose body had just registered something deeply wrong. She felt it through the bond before she consciously understood what she was feeling, a lurch, distant and terrible, like a floor giving way somewhere she couldn't see.
Rhys.
He didn't answer. His hand, resting on the table, had begun to shake, faintly at first and then with mounting violence, and the colour that never fully lived in his face to begin with drained further still, a sickly grey creeping up from beneath his collar. Across the table, Rhys was already on her feet, chair scraping back hard against the stone floor, eyes locked on Rhys with the particular sharpness of a soldier recognising an attack before anyone else in the room had caught up. Corin Vale, Selah noted even through her rising panic, had gone very still as well, his polished courtesy replaced by something that looked, for just an instant, like genuine alarm rather than performance, which told her, in the small clear-eyed part of her mind that never fully stopped cataloguing evidence, that whatever was happening had not been Thornwick's doing at all.
Poison, silver-worked. I can smell it in his blood from here.
The whole dissolved into controlled chaos, elders rising, the envoy's party exchanging alarmed glances that Selah, even in the panic of the moment, filed away as either genuine surprise or very good theatre. Rhys slid from his chair before anyone could catch him, and Selah was on the floor beside him before conscious thought caught up with instinct, hands already moving to his collar, to his pulse, cataloguing symptoms with the same clinical focus that had carried her through every crisis since she'd walked into this house.
Get him to the still room. Now. Rhys, I need to know exactly what silver compound does to a vampire's blood when it's ingested rather than cut, because that changes how fast this kills him and what I can do about it.
Her voice came out steady despite the terror climbing her spine. They carried him between them, Rhys and 2 guards, and Selah ran alongside giving orders with a calm she did not feel, because she had learned, across 2 crises now in this house, that panic was a luxury the person doing the healing did not get to spend. In the still room, by lamplight, she worked with a focus that narrowed the entire world down to the shape of the problem in front of her. Silver worked into the blood rather than the flesh spread differently than a blade wound. She reasoned aloud, thinking through it the way her mother had taught her to think through any poison, not by panicking at what it was, but by asking methodically what it needed to stop doing. It needed a binding agent to slow its spread. It needed heat to help his body fight it the way heat helped any fevered creature fight infection. And it needed something her herbalist's training had never once prepared her to provide alone. Rhys's eyes had gone glassy, tracking her movements with visible effort, his breathing gone shallow and fast in a way that terrified her more than the shaking had. Black veins had begun to rise beneath the skin at his throat, threading upward from wherever the poison had first entered his blood, the same terrible pattern she remembered dimly from every old story about silver poisoning she'd ever half believed as a child, and never once expected to see with her own eyes.
Talk to me, stay with me the way you asked me to stay with you. Can you do that?
Trying. Selah, if this...
Don't you dare finish that sentence. I didn't survive a blade in my side just to lose this argument to a poisoning 3 weeks later. Stay with me.
Her voice cracked just slightly and she let it.
The bond, Selah, you know what I'm about to suggest.
I know.
She didn't look up from the poultice she was grinding, hands moving fast and sure despite the tremor she could feel building beneath her own calm.
The exchange isn't finished. We were going to do it properly, in daylight, chosen without a crisis forcing the timing.
The wards don't care about your timing preferences. If the bond is even partially active, your blood might slow what's spreading through his faster than any poultice you can grind in the next 10 minutes.
Selah looked down at Rhys, grey and shaking on the still-room bed, his golden eyes struggling to hold focus on her face, and felt the decision settle into her with none of the fear it might once have carried and all of the clarity that 3 weeks in this house had slowly, carefully built.
Rhys.
She knelt beside him and took his shaking hand in both of hers.
I'm choosing this. Right now, in this room, with no blade in me and no one forcing either of us. I told you I wanted to finish it properly, in daylight. This isn't that, and I know it isn't, but I need you to hear me say plainly that this is still me choosing you, exactly the way I meant when I said it in the Great Hall. Do you understand?
His fingers tightened weakly around hers.
Selah, you don't have to.
I know I don't have to. I'm telling you I want to.
She drew the small blade from her healer's kit, the one she used for the finest, most careful work, and pressed the edge to her own palm before he could argue further, a shallow, deliberate cut that welled dark and immediate.
Drink, please. I need you to live long enough for us to argue about how romantic this wasn't later, when you're well enough to complain about it properly.
Something that might have been a laugh, weak and disbelieving, escaped him even through the pain, and then his mouth found her palm, and the bond between them flared to sudden, blazing life in a way the first exchange never had, not desperate this time, not born from a dying woman's last-second yes, but full and mutual and freely given on both sides at once, and Selah felt it settle through her like the last stone in an arch finally locking into place. The poison did not vanish instantly. It fought him for the better part of an hour, his body shaking through waves of fever and cold both, Selah never once leaving his side, murmuring the same steady stream of instruction and reassurance she'd have offered any patient, hands working the poultice into the worst of the silver-blackened veins at his throat, while the bond did the rest of the work no herb alone could have managed. She watched the black threading beneath his skin fight the warmth spreading out from where their blood had mingled, a slow, visible battle she had no way to hurry and every reason to fear, and she talked through it anyway, low and constant. The way she might have talked a frightened animal through a wound it didn't understand was healing.
You're doing this. Whatever's happening in there, some part of you is fighting it, and I need you to keep doing exactly that. I'm not asking you to be brave. I'm asking you to be stubborn, which I already know you're extremely good at.
She told him this somewhere in the worst of it, when his breathing had gone ragged and his hand in hers had tightened to something almost painful. A weak, disbelieving huff of breath escaped him that might, in better circumstances, have been a laugh, and something in her own chest eased a fraction at the sound of it, proof that whatever was left of him underneath the fever could still hear her clearly enough to find her ridiculous. When his colour finally began slowly to return, and his shaking eased into something closer to exhausted sleep, Selah sat back against the still-room wall and allowed herself, for the first time all night, to shake as hard as he had. Rhys pressed a cup of something warm into her hands without a word, and Selah drank it without asking what it was, too spent to care, watching the slow, steady rise and fall of Rhys's chest with a relief so total it left her almost as hollowed out as the fear had. Rhys found the proof within the hour, moving with the ruthless efficiency of a captain who had spent the whole poisoning working a second, quieter investigation alongside the crisis in the still-room. A serving vessel from the second course, discarded and unwashed in the kitchen's rush, tested positive for the same silver-worked compound now working its way slowly out of Rhys's blood, and the servant who had carried that particular vessel to the high table confessed, under Rhys's exact and unhurried questioning, to having received it already prepared from Holden's own hand not an hour before the meal began. If you want to see whether Holden actually gets caught, hit subscribe now, because what happens in the next chapter when this proof reaches the full council is exactly the confrontation this whole story has been building toward, and I promise you it does not disappoint. The council convened again before dawn, this time with Rhys standing at its center rather than at its edge, laying out the servant's confession and the tested vessel with the same careful, methodical precision she brought to everything. Holden, summoned from his own chambers, arrived already composed, already reaching for the same cold, patient calculation Selah had watched him deploy in every crisis since the night she'd first walked through the manor gates.
a servant's confession, extracted under duress, and a vessel that passed through a dozen hands in a kitchen preparing food for 40 guests. This is circumstantial at best, and I'd remind this council that accusing an elder of poisoning the king he served for 3 centuries requires considerably more than...
The watch ledgers. 3 nights over 2 months, guards pulled from the exact stretch of northern wall a Thornwick scout was later confirmed testing. Your handwriting, your seal, your signature authorizing every single reassignment.
She set the ledger down on the table in front of him with a sound that carried through the suddenly silent hall.
I wasn't looking for proof of poison when I found this, Elder. I was looking for a pattern. I found one, and now I have both.
An older elder near the head of the table, a stern silver-haired woman named Kaylee, who had sat through every council session with her face carefully unreadable, leaned forward to examine the ledger herself, running one finger down the column of dates and signatures with the deliberate care of someone who had trusted the man beside her for longer than she wanted to admit.
This is your seal, Holden. I would know it anywhere. I've watched you press it into wax at this very table for 2 centuries.
She looked up, and something old and disappointed moved behind her eyes.
Tell me this has an explanation I haven't yet imagined.
The silence that followed had a different quality than any Selah had felt in this hall before, not the murmuring uncertainty of the first council, not the tense watching of the second, but the specific, collective stillness of a room recognizing, all at once, that its old fear of one man's certainty had just run out of ground to stand on. Holden's composure did not shatter exactly. It simply finally stopped serving him. Selah watched something in his face give way, not to guilt, she thought, watching closely, but to the particular fury of a man who had spent 3 centuries believing his own necessity, only to watch a room full of people he'd manipulated for that long finally stop believing it with him.
You would choose them, a king too soft to rule and the human girl who softened him further. You have no idea what you're choosing to trust, and you will learn that lesson at considerably worse cost than a council vote.
He moved before the nearest guards could close around him, faster than any of them anticipated even knowing what he was, and was through the tall windows and gone into the pre-dawn dark before Rhys had fully cleared her sword from its sheath. The hall erupted into shouted orders, guards scrambling toward the broken glass, torches snatched from wall brackets and carried at a run toward the courtyard, and for a long, chaotic moment, it seemed the whole manor might spill out into the dark after him despite Rhys's steadying presence at the room's center.
Let him go. Chasing him into the dark plays exactly the game he's been playing all along. We know what he did now. The whole council knows. That matters more tonight than catching him.
The elders, one by one, inclined their heads, not the grudging, uncertain acknowledgement of 3 nights before, but something that had finally, fully shifted into genuine loyalty, hard-won and no longer performed out of habit or fear. Kaylee was the last to sit back down, her expression still troubled, and when she finally spoke, it was to Selah rather than to Rhys.
I owe you an apology, I think. I watched you stand in this hall 3 nights ago and tell us plainly what you'd chosen, and some part of me still assumed Holden's version of events, because it was easier to trust a man I'd known for 2 centuries than a girl I'd known for 3 weeks.
She shook her head slowly.
That was poor judgment on my part, and I won't make the same mistake twice.
You don't owe me anything. You owed the truth a fair hearing, and you gave it one the moment real evidence arrived instead of just accusations. That's more than plenty of people manage.
Rhys sheathed her sword slowly, watching the broken window with an expression that promised the pursuit was only postponed, not abandoned.
He'll run for Thornwick. Whatever alliance he's built there, he'll cash it in now that he's got nothing left to lose.
Then we better be ready before he arrives.
Though exhaustion still shadowed every line of him, there was something steadier in his voice than Selah had heard since the night the wards first chose her name. The sound of a king who had, finally, stopped fighting for his own conscience alone and started fighting openly for something he'd chosen to keep. They finished the exchange properly 2 mornings later, once Rhys had regained enough strength to stand steady on his own feet, and the manor had settled into the particular quiet that follows a crisis everyone has survived. There was no council watching this time, no blade forcing the timing, no poison working through his blood. There was only the two of them in the same firelit study, where he'd first told her the wards didn't get to choose for her, morning light falling clean and gold through the tall windows, and a choosing made slowly, deliberately, exactly the unhurried way both of them had wanted it from the start.
No blade in either of us, no crisis clock, just us.
He said this afterward, tracing his thumb once lightly over the small mark now healed at her throat.
Just us, 300 years, and you waited for someone to actually mean it. I hope it was worth the wait.
She felt the bond settle into place around her, not as a chain, exactly the way she'd told Freddie, but as something closer to a second pulse she'd chosen to carry rather than one that had chosen her.
It was worth every century of it, though I'll admit I would have appreciated a slightly less dramatic delivery on the final proof.
She laughed, real and unguarded, and for a few precious hours that morning before the raven came, the manor felt like nothing more than a home two people had chosen together. Dawn was breaking fully over the black pines when the raven found the manor's highest tower, 3 days later, a small dark shape circling once before it dropped its burden onto the stone sill of Rhys's study and vanished back into the grey morning sky. Selah was the one who found the message first, a single folded parchment sealed in dark wax stamped with a crest neither of them had ever seen up close before, Thornwick's own seal, a wolf's head crowned in thorns, pressed into wax the colour of old blood. She broke it open with hands that had, over the last 2 weeks, learned to be steady through far worse than a sealed letter, and read the single line written in a hand too precise and cold to belong to anyone but a man who had spent 3 centuries perfecting his own patience. We have your elder, and everything he knows. You have until the next full moon to answer for what your king has cost this alliance. Do not mistake our patience for mercy a second time. Selah stood very still in the grey morning light, the letter trembling faintly in her grip. Not with fear this time, she realized, but with something closer to the cold, clear focus of a woman who had already survived one impossible night in this house, and intended to survive whatever came next, too. She thought of Corin Vale's polished, probing courtesy at the dinner table, of the genuine alarm that had crossed his face when Rhys collapsed, and understood, reading the letter's cold precision a second time, that whatever alliance Holden had struck with Thornwick ran considerably deeper than one envoy's formal visit had let on. This had been planned for longer than a poisoning, perhaps for longer than her own arrival at these gates.
Rhys, you need to see this.
He crossed the room to her side, read the letter over her shoulder in silence, and when he finally looked up, the exhaustion of the last 2 weeks had settled into something harder and more resolved beneath it.
Then Thornwick's finally decided to stop testing our walls and start testing our resolve instead.
He took her hand, steady now in a way that felt, after everything, entirely earned.
We have a full moon to prepare for a war neither of us asked for. I would very much like to face it with you standing exactly where you're standing right now.
Selah folded the letter carefully, tucked it into her healer's satchel beside the herbs and bandages that had carried her through every crisis this house had handed her so far, and looked out through the broken window toward the mended wall and the dark tree line beyond it, where somewhere, under a rising moon that had not yet come, Thornwick was already counting down the days. She thought of the wards choosing her name on a summer afternoon that felt now like it belonged to some other, smaller version of her life. She thought of a man who had asked instead of taken, 3 separate times at real cost to himself, before she had ever given him reason to believe the asking would be worth it. She thought of Holden's cold, patient certainty finally running out of ground to stand on in front of a full council, and of the letter now folded carefully against her herbs and bandages, promising a reckoning neither of them had chosen but both of them. She understood now, fully intended to meet standing. Behind her, somewhere in the mending walls of a coven that had, over the last 2 weeks, slowly become something closer to a home than she had ever expected a vampire king's manor to be. She could hear the ordinary sounds of a household waking into another day, kitchen fires being stoked, boots on stone, Trevon's voice somewhere below arguing cheerfully with another guard about whether his leg was truly fit for duty yet. Ordinary sounds, worth protecting, worth whatever the full moon was coming to ask of both of them.
Then let's not waste a single one of them.
The moon rose early over Ashmere Hollow, 3 nights ahead of its fullness, and Rhys felt the wrongness of it before he ever climbed to the watchtower to see for himself. Some old, animal instinct in him had learned, across 3 centuries, to read the sky the way a sailor reads weather, and the sky tonight was lying to him, swollen and silver bright when it had no business being either. He found Rhys already at the tower's edge when he arrived, her jaw set, her eyes fixed on the black tree line beyond the mended wall, where torches had begun to bloom in ragged clusters through the pines like something poisonous flowering all at once. They're not waiting for the full moon. Thornwick's massing at the tree line right now. I count at least 60 torches, and that's only what's visible from here.
Holden.
The name came out of him like something bitten off.
Has to be. Whatever leverage he sold them on our internal fracture. It's rotting faster than he expected, or he wouldn't be pushing the timeline early.
Rhys finally turned to face him, and the grim calculation in her expression told him everything about how badly outmatched their numbers currently stood.
We lost 11 guards to Holden's reassignments before we ever caught him. We haven't finished rebuilding the Northern Watch. If that's 60 torches at the tree line, Rhys, we do not have 60 defenders to answer them with.
She was quiet a moment, watching the distant torches multiply against the black tree line.
I keep thinking about the ledger. Every guard he pulled off that watch rotation. Every night he weakened us just enough to keep Thornwick's scouts confident. All of it leading here, to this exact night, this exact math. 3 months of careful sabotage, and we're the ones who have to answer for it in the next few hours regardless of how thoroughly we've since exposed him.
Then we answer for it the way we've answered for everything else since, plainly and together and without pretending the math is better than it is.
Selah found them there minutes later, breathless from the climb, her healer's satchel already slung across her body out of pure reflex, and the sight of the distant torchlight blooming through the black pines settled into her stomach with a cold, familiar weight she recognized from the night the wards first broke.
How long do we have?
Hours, not days.
His voice had gone flat and steady in the particular way she'd learned meant he was containing something larger underneath it.
We prepare for tonight, not for the full moon Thornwick promised us. Whatever this is, it's starting now.
Consider hitting subscribe right now, because episode 3 is the one this entire story has been building toward, and if you leave before the end of this one, you are going to regret it. Like the video if your heart's already racing, and tell me in the comments whether you think the coven can actually hold that wall. By midnight, the manor had transformed into something Selah had not seen it become even during the first assault months before, a coven bracing for a siege it had never fully finished recovering from. Guards moved along the wall in the dark, reinforcing weak sections with whatever stone and timber could be gathered on short notice. The household staff, who had spent weeks learning to trust Selah now, looked to her without being told to, clearing the manor's largest ground floor hall of furniture and turning it, wordlessly, into a triage station under her direction, because everyone in that house had learned, by now, exactly whose competence to trust when the fighting started.
Cots along the west wall. Clean linens sorted by size, largest wounds first. Boiling water on every hearth we can spare. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, we won't have time to improvise later.
Trevon found her there, already in his patrol leathers despite the leg that had only fully healed weeks before, checking the edge of a short blade with the focused seriousness of a young guard determined to prove himself worthy of the position Rhys had given him back. "They're saying you're setting up in the Great Hall," he said. "Rhys wants me on the eastern gate rotation. I wanted to tell you myself in case," he stopped, visibly uncomfortable finishing the thought.
In case you end up on one of these cots. I heard you the first time you tried not to say it. You'll be fine, Trevon. And if you're not, I'll be right here, same as last time.
She met his eyes steadily.
Come back to me in one piece if you can manage it. That's an order from your healer, not a request.
He managed something that was almost a grin despite the tension in his shoulders, and jogged off toward the eastern wall to take up his position, and Selah watched him go with the particular ache of someone who had learned, over these last months, exactly how much it cost to care about people you couldn't protect from everything. Freddie found her next, hauling a crate of bandages toward the growing triage station, sweat already beading at his temple despite the cold night air. "Never fought in anything bigger than a border skirmish," he admitted, setting the crate down. "Is it always like this, the waiting before?"
The waiting's the worst part for most people. Once it starts, your body mostly stops giving you a choice about being afraid. It just does what it's trained to do.
She squeezed his shoulder briefly.
You'll be fine. Stay close to the guards who have done this before, and don't try to be a hero in the first 10 minutes. Heroes in the first 10 minutes are usually the ones I end up treating.
Rhys found her there an hour before dawn, arms full of bandage rolls she'd personally raided from the coven stores, and set them down without comment, the closest thing to a compliment the captain's economy of words ever allowed.
You've done this before, not the healing. The preparing for it, this isn't your first war.
It's my first war with fangs in it.
She kept working, hands quick and sure over the linens, folding each one with the same unhurried precision regardless of how fast her heart was actually beating beneath the calm.
But I've watched border skirmishes come through the Hollow before. My mother used to say the difference between surviving a battle and dying in one usually comes down to whether someone thought to boil the water an hour before it was needed instead of an hour after.
Rhys and Rhys held their war council in the map room an hour later, the same room where Selah had first watched Rhys catalogue his herb stores by lamplight, now spread with maps of the boundary wall marked in tight, urgent notation. Selah stood at the table's edge, not fully part of the military planning, but unwilling to be shut out of it either, and listened as Rhys laid out the grim mathematics of their defense.
42 able defenders, counting every guard we have left after Holden's sabotage.
She traced a finger along the northern wall's weakest sections.
If Thornwick's torch count holds, we're outnumbered close to 2 to 1, maybe worse. The wall favors us, height, choke points at the 2 gates, ground they'll have to cross in the open before they reach us. But numbers like that don't stay in our favor forever, especially if they've got anyone among them who knows the boundary's weak points as well as Holden does.
Which he does. 3 centuries of knowing exactly where this wall has always been thinnest.
Can we send word to any other coven for support? Allies, old treaties, anyone who might reach us before this fully breaks.
Nothing close enough to matter tonight.
He shook his head.
The nearest coven withstanding enough to intervene is 4 days' hard ride, and that assumes they'd even choose to involve themselves in what looks, from the outside, like an internal dispute between 2 rival houses. We fight this with what we have, or we don't fight it at all.
Then we don't fight the fight he's expecting.
Both of them looked up at her. She hadn't meant to speak exactly, but the shape of the problem had assembled itself in her mind with the same clarity that used to guide her through triaging a dozen wounds at once, sorting urgency from noise, the same instinct that had once told her, standing over a bleeding stranger in a burning village square, which wound would kill first and which could wait.
You said the ground favors defenders who make attackers cross open space first. What if the weak sections of the wall aren't actually weaknesses tonight? What if they're bait? Reinforce them just enough that they look barely holding, and funnel the heaviest assault exactly where you want it concentrated, instead of spread thin across the whole boundary guessing where Holden's going to strike.
Rhys studied the map for a long moment, then looked up with something that might have been the first genuine respect she'd shown Selah in a purely military context.
That's not a healer's instinct.
It's the same instinct. You triage the wound that's actually going to kill someone instead of spending all your bandages on the one that just looks the worst. This isn't so different.
Rhys traced the proposed funnel point along the eastern approach with new interest, mentally recalculating positions as she went.
If we pull the strongest fighters here, and stage the healing station close enough to reach quickly, but far enough to stay clear of the worst of it.
She glanced up.
This could work. It's a gamble, but every option left to us tonight is a gamble. This is at least a gamble with better odds than standing our full strength thin across a boundary we can't fully man.
Rhys watched Selah with an expression she was beginning to recognize as something between pride and quiet, helpless love. The particular look he got when she surprised him in ways he hadn't stopped being surprised by even after everything they'd survived together.
Then that's the plan. We funnel them toward the eastern approach. Rhys, redistribute the strongest defenders there before dawn.
Rhys left to see the redistribution carried out, and for a brief, unguarded moment, Selah and Rhys stood alone over the map table, the weight of the coming hours settling between them in a silence neither seemed inclined to fill with false reassurance. Selah traced one finger along the mapped boundary line without quite meaning to.
I keep thinking about the first night. How certain I was that the danger in this house would look like violence. It never once occurred to me it might look like waiting for violence to arrive instead, knowing exactly how outmatched we are and having to plan calmly anyway.
That's most of ruling, if I'm honest. Centuries of learning to plan calmly through fear you're not permitted to show anyone else. I used to think that made me strong. I'd since learned it mostly just made me lonely.
He reached for her hand across the table.
I'm glad I don't have to do this part alone anymore, whatever else tonight costs us.
You won't. Whatever happens out there, you come back to this table. That's not a request either.
He almost smiled at the echo of what she'd told Trevon and opened his mouth to answer when a guard burst into the map room without ceremony, breathless, reporting a lone rider approaching under a white parley flag from the direction of the tree line. Rhys and Rhys exchanged a single sharp glance before moving, and Selah followed close behind, her heart climbing into her throat at the thought of what a parley flag from Thornwick's camp might actually mean this close to an assault already visibly underway. They met the rider at the outer gate in the grey pre-dawn light, and Selah recognized him before he'd even fully dismounted, Corin Vale, alone, his dark grey travelling clothes torn at one shoulder, his usually composed face carrying the specific exhaustion of a man who had ridden hard through hostile ground to get here.
I'm not here on Thornwick's authority. I need to speak with Selah, alone if she'll permit it. Though I understand if none of you are inclined to grant a Thornwick lord that particular courtesy tonight.
He held his hands raised, empty, before any of the watching guards could mistake his intent. If you want to see whether Corin's actually telling the truth, hit subscribe now, because whatever he says next changes everything about how this siege plays out, and I promise you it is not the conversation anyone at that gate was expecting.
You'll speak in front of all of us, or not at all. Say what you came to say, Vale, and say it quickly.
His voice carried the flat, dangerous calm of a king whose coven was hours from being overrun. Corin's exhausted composure held, but something in his careful expression suggested he had anticipated exactly this reception and prepared for it.
Holden did not come to Thornwick with an alliance. He came with a wager that our leadership would trade a war for the promise of a weakened rival coven's territory once he'd finished destabilizing it from within. My father, Lord Vale, accepted that wager against my council and against the council of half our own council because Holden's information about your internal fracture was compelling enough to make the risk look small.
He glanced toward Selah specifically.
That fracture no longer exists. You proved that plainly enough both at your council and in how thoroughly your own people have rallied behind you since. Holden knows it too, which is exactly why he's pushed the attack 3 nights ahead of the deadline he promised us. Because every day that passes without visible chaos in this coven, his usefulness to my father erodes a little further, and he knows it.
You're saying Thornwick's about to attack a coven for reasons that no longer exist. Because the man who convinced them to attack needs the attack to happen before anyone realizes his reasons stopped being true.
I'm saying exactly that.
Corin's exhaustion showed plainly now, the composed envoy mask finally slipping.
I opposed this alliance from the moment Holden first brought it to my father's table. I've spent the last several days trying quietly to build enough support among our own council to withdraw before this became irreversible. I failed. My father has already committed forces to the tree line, and Holden has convinced him the moment for hesitation has passed.
He met Rhys's eyes directly.
I cannot stop the assault that's already massing out there tonight. I can tell you honestly that a portion of Thornwick's own leadership does not believe in this war, and that if there is any way to expose Holden's manipulation clearly enough, publicly enough, before the fighting fully begins, my father may still be reachable. He is proud, but he is not a fool, and he does not enjoy discovering he is being played for one.
What proof do you have, beyond your own word, that any of this is true rather than a convenient story built to buy Thornwick more time to finish massing?
None that would satisfy a skeptical captain, I'll admit.
Something almost like respect crossed Corin's tired face at the sharpness of the question.
I have my own reputation, which I've spent considerably more carefully than Holden ever spent his, and which I am risking entirely by riding here alone tonight, instead of standing with my father's forces at the tree line. I have the fact that if I wanted this coven weakened, the far simpler path would have been silence and not a ride through hostile ground that could easily have gotten me killed before I ever reached your gate.
He spread his hands slightly.
I recognize that isn't proof in the way a captain's training would want it to be. It's the only currency I have left to offer tonight, and I'm offering all of it.
He held Rhys's gaze steadily, neither flinching nor pressing further, the particular stillness of a man who understood exactly how much he was asking, and had decided to ask it plainly anyway, rather than dress it up in anything softer. Rhys's expression remained carefully skeptical throughout, arms crossed, weight balanced for violence if this conversation turned out to be exactly the trap it easily could have been.
And why should any of us believe a Thornwick lord rode alone into our territory at genuine risk to himself, purely out of conscience?
Corin's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile.
Because I watched the vampire king nearly die of silver poisoning at his own dinner table 3 weeks ago, and I watched the woman beside him choose, without a single second of hesitation, to bleed for him in front of an entire hall of strangers rather than let him go. I have lived a very long time among people who treat power as the only currency worth spending. I had genuinely forgotten what it looked like when someone spent something else instead.
He looked at Selah again.
I don't expect you to trust me on faith. I'm asking you to let me try to reach my father before Holden gets what he actually wants tonight, which isn't Thornwick's victory. It's Thornwick's blood on his hands regardless of who wins, because either outcome proves him right to the only audience he has left.
Rhys was quiet for a long moment, weighing something Selah could feel through the bond, even without seeing it plainly on his face. Old caution warring against the particular, hard-won instinct he'd learned over these last months, to trust her judgment even when it ran ahead of his own.
What do you think?
He asked her quietly, in front of Rhys and Corin both, a question that cost him something to ask so openly, and that he asked anyway. Selah looked at Corin Vale, at the torn shoulder, the genuine exhaustion, the particular quality of a man who had ridden into hostile territory carrying nothing but a hope he wasn't fully certain would land, and thought of every honest conversation that had built the trust this coven now stood on, one plain exchange at a time.
I think he's telling the truth, not because I can prove it, because I've spent 3 months learning to recognize the difference between a man performing sincerity and a man who's simply run out of better options and decided honesty is what's left. This is the second kind.
She turned to Rhys.
Let him try. If Holden's counting on chaos to force Thornwick's hand before anyone can stop him, then the fastest way to blunt that is exactly what Corin's offering. Expose it before the fighting fully starts, not after.
Rhys held her gaze a moment longer, then turned to Corin with the particular, deliberate weight of a decision made.
You have until the wall is breached to reach your father, Vale, not a moment longer. If Thornwick's forces cross that boundary in force before you've made your case, we will treat every soul among them as an enemy, regardless of what you believe in your heart, because my people's survival does not wait on your father's conscience.
That's more time than I hoped for. I won't waste it.
He mounted quickly, gathering the reins with the economical efficiency of a man who had spent his whole life learning to move fast when speed actually mattered, and cast one last glance back toward the gate before turning his horse toward the distant torchlight. He rode back into the grey dawn light toward the massing torches, and Selah watched him go with her heart still climbing, uncertain whether she had just helped avert a war or handed Thornwick a perfectly timed distraction while Holden's forces prepared to strike. She turned back toward the manor and found Rhys watching her with an unreadable expression.
You trusted him faster than I would have.
I didn't trust him because it was easy. I trusted him because the alternative was assuming everyone who rides toward us under a flag of truce is automatically lying. And I've watched what happens to a coven that starts operating from that assumption instead of judging each person plainly, on the evidence in front of them. I watched it nearly cost Rhys his crown.
She met Rhys's eyes.
I'd rather be wrong once, honestly, than right permanently by refusing to ever extend anyone the benefit of the doubt again.
Rhys considered that for a long moment, then nodded once, the particular economical gesture that had become, over these last months, the closest thing to full agreement the captain ever offered.
Fair enough. Let's hope tonight proves you right.
She did not have long to wonder. The assault came within the hour, faster and harder than even Rhys's grim calculations had prepared for, a wave of dark shapes surging out of the tree line, toward the wall's weakened eastern section exactly as their trap had anticipated, and the manor's defenders met them there with everything Rhys had spent the night arranging. Selah's triage station filled within minutes of the first clash, guards carried in on stretchers faster than she could fully process the wounds before the next arrived, and she fell into the same clinical, unhurried rhythm that had carried her through every crisis this house had handed her, cutting away torn leather, packing wounds, calling instructions to the household staff who had, weeks ago, become something closer to a second set of trained hands than she'd ever expected them to be.
Pressure here, don't let go until I tell you.
She said this to a kitchen maid, holding linen against a guard's shoulder wound, already moving to the next stretcher, already assessing the next set of injuries with the same triage instinct that had once sorted Thornwick's honesty from its danger at the outer gate. The sounds of battle carried faintly even into the manor's stone halls, muffled shouts and the clash of steel, and every time the noise spiked she felt her attention split, half on the wound in front of her and half, always, on the distant thread of the bond that told her Rhys was still standing, still fighting, still alive. Dina, the miller's wife from the village who had learned to trust Selah's hands months before during the first assault, arrived at the triage station with 2 of her neighbours in tow, all 3 women falling into the rhythm of packing wounds and boiling water without needing to be told twice, and Selah found herself grateful, in the small clear-eyed part of her mind that never fully stopped working even in crisis. For every honest evening she'd spent in the kitchens and lower halls building exactly this kind of trust before it was ever needed. One of Dina's neighbours, a stout older woman with flour still dusted along one sleeve from an interrupted evening's baking, worked with the same brisk competence Selah had come to recognise in every villager who'd ever lived through hardship enough to know exactly what needed doing without being told twice. A guard she didn't recognise was carried in with a gash along his forearm deep enough to require careful stitching, and as she worked, hands steady despite the chaos around her, he gritted out through the pain, "Word from the eastern wall says it's holding. Barely. They funneled the worst of it right where the captain said they would."
Good, keep that arm elevated. You're done fighting tonight whether you like it or not.
She tied off the final stitch with practiced speed. He nodded, already looking past her toward the doorway, toward the sounds of battle still carrying faintly from beyond the walls, and Selah moved on to the next stretcher before he could argue the point. A young stable hand came through minutes later with a burned hand from an overturned torch, and behind her, 2 guards carrying a third between them who had taken a glancing blow to the head, dazed but conscious, muttering something about the western gate holding despite heavy pressure. Selah triaged them with the same brisk, unhurried focus she'd brought to every wound before it, sorting urgency from noise the way her mother had taught her, the way 3 months in this house had sharpened into something close to instinct. It was well into the fighting, hours stretching into something that felt both endless and impossibly fast, that she felt the bond lurch, not the slow, sickening drain of poison this time, but something sharper and more immediate, a spike of danger so acute it drove the breath from her lungs even mid-stitch, her hands going still over a wounded guard's arm.
Rhys.
She breathed his name, and the guard beneath her hands, dazed with pain, still had the presence of mind to say urgently, "Go, we'll manage, go." She went, because the bond was screaming through her in a way it never had before, pulling her toward the eastern wall with an urgency that overrode every careful, methodical instinct she'd built her whole healer's life around. She found him at the wall's breach point, exactly where the trap had funneled Thornwick's heaviest assault, and found, standing across from him in the churned mud and torchlight, Holden, not fighting alongside Thornwick's soldiers, but apart from them deliberately, facing Rhys with a blade already drawn and 3 centuries of history compressed into the terrible stillness between them. The fighting around them had not stopped, but it had in some strange and terrible way given the 2 men space, guards from both sides instinctively clearing the ground around a confrontation that clearly belonged to no one but them. Selah stopped short at the edge of the churned mud, chest heaving from the run, and understood, looking at the 2 of them facing each other in the torchlight, that she was witnessing the true shape of a wound that had been 3 centuries in the making, one that no council vote or exposed ledger had ever fully closed.
You could have simply let this coven fall on its own weaknesses. Instead, you're standing here, in the open, risking everything on a single confrontation you didn't need to force. Why?
His own blade was raised, blood already streaked across one sleeve from earlier fighting.
Because you were never going to fall on your own.
Something in his voice had shed every last trace of cold political calculation, left raw and furious, and underneath all of it, something that sounded, to Selah's ears, disturbingly close to grief.
I watched you build something soft and merciful out of 3 centuries of guilt, and I watched this coven love you for it anyway, and I could not make a single one of them understand what that softness would eventually cost, until I had no options left but to force the cost into the open myself.
His blade didn't waver.
I did not want this war, Rhys. I wanted you to be strong enough that it never had to happen. You were never going to choose that on your own.
If you're feeling the weight of this confrontation the way I am, drop a comment right now, because whatever happens between these two in the next few minutes decides everything this whole story has been building toward, and I need to know who you think walks away from this.
You think forcing my hand through poison and treachery proves your point about strength?
He circled slowly, blade steady despite the visible exhaustion of hours of fighting already behind him.
It proves the opposite, Holden. A man secure in his own convictions doesn't need to manufacture a crisis to make them true. He simply lives them, plainly, and lets the people around him decide for themselves whether they're worth following. I did that. You watched me do it for 3 centuries, and instead of trusting the coven to see it, you decided you knew better than every single soul in these walls what they actually needed.
Something in Holden's expression cracked, just slightly, the same way it had in the council chamber weeks before, and for one brief, terrible moment Selah saw, beneath 3 centuries of cold calculation, something that looked almost like a man drowning in the wreckage of his own certainty.
Then prove it.
He lunged. The fight that followed happened faster than Selah's eyes could fully track, blades flashing in the churned torchlight, both men moving with a speed and violence that belonged to something far older than the human world she'd grown up in. She pressed herself against the walls in her stone, healer's instinct screaming at her to help, and every ounce of remaining sense telling her that stepping into that particular storm would only get her killed before she could do either of them any good. It was Holden's blade that found Rhys first, a vicious opening strike that caught him along the ribs and sent him staggering back against the broken stone, and Selah felt the wound through the bond as sharply as if it had opened in her own body, a white-hot lance of pain that drove a cry from her before she could stop it. She pressed her hand hard against the stone at her side, vision swimming for one terrible instant, and understood with a clarity that would stay with her long after the battle ended, exactly how thin the membrane between the two of them had truly become. Rhys staggered but did not fall, one hand pressed to the wound at his ribs, blood dark against his torn sleeve, his blade still raised despite the visible cost of holding it there. Holden advanced on him with the terrible, unhurried certainty of a man who believed, in that moment, that he had finally proven every argument he'd spent 3 centuries building. Holden pressed the advantage, blade raised for what would have been a killing strike, and it was in that exact instant that a second figure crashed into him from the side, tearing him off balance and away from Rhys, with a violence that sent both men sprawling into the mud. Corin Vale rose first, his own blade drawn now, standing between Holden and Rhys with an expression that had entirely shed whatever careful diplomatic distance he'd carried at the outer gate hours before.
You lied to my father. You lied to an entire council, and you nearly got hundreds of my people killed for a war that never needed to happen, built on a fracture that stopped existing weeks before you forced this fight.
His voice had gone hard in a way Selah hadn't heard from him before, all trace of the polished envoy stripped away.
I came here tonight hoping to stop a war. I did not expect to also be the one who finally stopped you.
Holden rose from the mud slowly, blade still in hand, and for a long moment looked between Corin and Rhys with something that had finally, entirely, run out of the cold certainty that had carried him through 3 centuries of careful manipulation.
You would choose them too.
His voice had gone strange, hollow, the particular sound of a man finally hearing, out loud, exactly how alone his own convictions had left him.
Everyone, every single person I have spent 3 centuries trying to protect from their own softness, and every one of you chooses the soft thing anyway.
Maybe.
He pushed himself upright against the stone despite the wound at his ribs, his voice carrying none of the triumph the moment might have earned him, and all of the exhausted, genuine grief that had lived beneath 3 centuries of failing to reach the man in front of him.
Maybe the softness was never the weakness you believed it was, Holden. Maybe it's the only thing that's ever actually held this coven together, and you spent 3 centuries so certain of your own fear that you never once let yourself find out.
Something in Holden's face in that final moment seemed to finally, terribly believe him, not enough to lay down the blade, not enough to surrender, but enough that when he moved again, it wasn't toward Rhys or Corin at all. He stood very still for one long, terrible breath, blade still raised, looking between the vampire king he had served for 3 centuries and the Thornwick lord who had just chosen, at real cost, to stand against him, and something in his marble composure finally, completely, gave way, not into rage, not into the cold calculation that had carried him this far, but into something that looked, for just an instant, disturbingly like grief for a version of himself he had lost sight of a very long time ago.
I only ever wanted this coven safe.
His voice had gone quiet now, stripped of every trace of the certainty that had armored him through 3 centuries of careful manipulation.
I don't know anymore whether that was ever entirely true, or whether I simply told myself it was true for so long that I stopped being able to tell the difference.
He turned instead toward the breach in the wall, toward the chaos of Thornwick's retreating forces now pulling back under Corin's shouted orders to his own men, and ran, alone, into the dark beyond the boundary, not fleeing a fight he might still have won, but fleeing, Selah understood with a sudden, aching clarity, the unbearable weight of finally seeing himself clearly. Nobody pursued him. The battle around them was already collapsing into retreat, Thornwick's soldiers pulling back from the wall as word spread of Corin's open defiance, and within the hour the churned, torchlit ground before the manor's eastern wall had gone quiet, the coven's exhausted defenders standing amid the wreckage of a war that had ended almost as suddenly as it had begun. Selah reached Rhys's side the moment it was safe to move, hands already working at the wound along his ribs with the same clinical urgency that had carried her through every crisis this house had handed her, and felt, beneath her steady hands, the particular relief of a wound that would heal rather than one that would kill.
You felt that. Through the bond, I felt you feel it.
I felt all of it, not just the fear. The pain, too, the second his blade found you, sharp enough I nearly went down myself.
She finished the binding and finally met his eyes, something complicated and still settling moving behind her own.
I don't think I understood, until right now, exactly what this bond actually costs either of us when things go wrong. I've felt your exhaustion before. Your worry, I've never felt you nearly die.
Rhys reached for her hand, steady despite the wound still knitting beneath her careful work.
I felt it too when the blade caught your side that first night. I have had months to sit with what that meant. You had exactly 1 battle's worth of warning.
He studied her face carefully.
Tell me honestly, does that frighten you?
Selah considered the question with the same honesty she'd learned over these last months, was the only currency that actually mattered in this house.
It should. I think some part of me expected it to, the moment it happened. But mostly what I feel, sitting here with your blood still on my hands and my heart still not fully slowed down, is that I'm glad I felt it. Glad I knew, in that exact instant, exactly how much danger you were in, instead of finding out, after the fact, the way I might have if we'd never chosen this at all.
She held his gaze.
I don't think I'd trade that knowing away, even for the fear that comes with it. I think that's just what it means to actually let someone matter this much.
There's a version of this bond that some of the old texts describe, in couples who've carried it long enough, not just feeling danger in the moment, the way we just did. Feeling each other's thoughts sometimes, sharing strengths directly in a crisis, the way you shared your blood with me during the poisoning, but without needing the blood at all eventually. I don't fully understand it myself. I've never lived long enough with a bond that survived to see it deepen that far.
He looked down at their joined hands.
I find I'm not frightened of that the way I once assumed I would be. I find I'm curious what it becomes now that we've both chosen it plainly, more than once, with clear eyes each time.
Then we'll find out together, the same way we've found out everything else in this house so far. Slowly, honestly, and usually with entirely too much blood involved for my personal taste.
That surprised a real laugh out of him, rough and unguarded, and something in Selah's chest eased at the sound of it, proof that whatever the night had cost both of them, some essential, stubborn warmth between them had survived it intact. Around them, the manor's exhausted household began the long work of tending its wounded and counting its costs, Rhys moving among the defenders with quiet, steady competence, Corin Vale standing at the wall's breach watching his own retreating soldiers, with an expression that suggested he had just spent every last reserve of political capital he possessed, and had no clear idea yet what remained of his standing at Thornwick when he returned. Selah watched him for a long moment, understanding, with a clarity that had nothing to do with triage and everything to do with 3 months of learning to read the true shape of loyalty in this house, that whatever came next for the coven of Ashmere Hollow, the war they had just survived, had already begun reshaping the world beyond its walls in ways none of them could fully see yet. Trevon found her a short while later, limping slightly but upright, a shallow cut along one cheekbone, the only visible mark of the night's fighting, and Selah felt a wave of relief so total it nearly buckled her knees at the sight of him whole. "Told you I'd come back in one piece," he said, managing a tired grin despite the exhaustion carved into his young face. "Mostly one piece anyway." She checked the cut with quick, practiced hands before deciding it needed nothing more than a clean dressing.
Close enough. Where's Freddie?
"Eastern Gate, last I saw him, helped drag 2 of our wounded clear during the worst of it." Trevon's grin faded into something more solemn. "He did good tonight. First real fight of his life, and he didn't freeze once. I don't think he even knows yet how well he did." Freddie appeared minutes later as if summoned by his own name, mud-streaked and hollow-eyed with the particular shock of a young man who had just survived his first true battle, and Selah checked him over with the same brisk efficiency, finding nothing worse than bruising and exhaustion beneath the grime.
You did well tonight. Better than well. Go get some rest. That's an order, same as it was for Trevon.
Something in his shoulders eased at the words. He nodded, too tired for words, gave her a small, grateful, exhausted smile that reminded her, briefly and vividly, of the eager young man who had asked her plainly about the bond over bowls of stew weeks earlier, and shuffled off toward the barracks, and Selah watched him go with the same fierce, protective warmth she'd felt watching Trevon walk away hours before, grateful in the quiet space between one crisis and the next, for every single person this house had somehow, gradually, taught her to love. Kaylee found them there as the last of the fighting's noise settled, her formal robes replaced by simpler traveling clothes, a healer's kit of her own slung over one shoulder, in clear imitation of Selah's own habits over the last months.
The western cots are full.
She knelt briefly beside Rhys to inspect the binding at his ribs, with the practiced eye of someone who had learned quickly under pressure.
We lost 6. It could have been considerably worse. And I think everyone in this coven knows exactly whose planning kept it from being worse.
She looked at Selah with something that had settled over these last weeks into genuine and uncomplicated respect.
The eastern funnel held because you saw the shape of this battle before any of the rest of us did. I won't forget that.
Selah glanced toward Rhys and Rhys both.
I had good teachers. This wasn't only mine to claim.
No, but you're the one who saw it first. And that matters. Whatever else gets said about how this night unfolded.
She rose, brushing mud from her knees with brisk efficiency.
I'll see to the wounded lists. Rest, both of you, while there's still a quiet hour left to take it in.
She moved off toward the triage station, and Selah felt, watching her go, the particular satisfaction of a trust finally, fully earned rather than merely granted. If this whole series has kept you up later than you meant to stay, hit subscribe before you go, and drop a comment telling me which episode hit hardest for you, because there is still more of this story left to tell, and I don't want you to miss a single piece of what comes next. The moon, full and silver and no longer lying about anything, hung low over the black pines as the last of the fighting's noise finally settled into silence, and Selah, sitting in the churned mud beside the man she had chosen twice now, felt the bond between them settle into something that had survived its first real test and come out the other side changed by it, not broken, not diminished, but deepened in a way she suspected she would spend a long time still learning the full shape of.
We won.
We did, though I suspect Holden was right about one thing, even if he was wrong about nearly everything else.
What's that?
That this was never going to be the last cost this softness asks of us.
He looked out toward the dark tree line where Holden had vanished, toward the retreating shapes of Thornwick's forces pulling back under a rising, honest moon.
Whatever's coming next, I would still rather face it soft than face it the way he did. Certain and alone, and finally undone by the very thing he spent 3 centuries convinced would save him.
He took her hand, steady now in the particular way that had become, over these last months, the truest thing she knew about him.
Come, let's go count what we still have left. together before we start wondering what comes after.
Selah thought, standing there in the churned mud with the moon finally honest above them, of everything the last 3 months had cost and given both of them in equal, tangled measure. A home she hadn't expected to find, a coven she hadn't expected to love, a bond that had asked more of her tonight than she'd ever imagined it could and had, somehow, left her more certain rather than less that she'd chosen rightly. Whatever Thornwick's shattered leadership decided in the days ahead, whatever became of Holden out there in the dark, whatever the bond between them still had left to teach her, she found she was ready, in a way she hadn't been even a season ago, to meet all of it standing. Selah rose with him, feeling the ache of the night's fear still settling slowly out of her bones, and looked one last time toward the quiet, moonlit wound in the wall where a war had ended almost as quickly as it began, and toward the bond beneath her skin, still humming faintly with the memory of a danger she now understood, with sudden and total clarity, she would carry every trace of for as long as either of them lived. Behind them the manor stood mended and standing, exactly as it had after every crisis before this one, and Selah found, walking back toward it beside the man she'd chosen twice now, that she no longer needed to wonder whether it had truly become home. She already knew. They walked back toward the manor together, past carts full of the wounded she would spend the rest of the night tending, past Rhys already organizing the exhausted defenders into a watch rotation for whatever remained of the darkness, past Corin Vale standing alone at the breach, staring toward the tree line where his own people had retreated, and where, somewhere beyond it, Holden had vanished into a darkness of his own making. Selah paused beside him for a moment, unable to simply walk past someone carrying that particular weight without at least acknowledging it.
You did the right thing tonight, whatever it costs you at Thornwick when you return.
I know that plainly enough in my head.
He did not look away from the tree line.
I'm not certain yet whether the rest of me has caught up to believing it. My father will call this treason before he calls it conscience, and I don't know which version of that conversation waits for me when I ride back through those trees.
He finally turned to look at her, something rueful and exhausted in his expression.
I find, strangely, that I don't regret it regardless. There's a particular kind of freedom in finally doing the thing you know is right instead of the thing that's merely safe. I understand now why you and your king seem to manage it so consistently.
It doesn't get less frightening. You just get more practice deciding it's worth doing anyway.
He almost smiled at that, a small, tired, genuine thing that softened the exhaustion still carved into his face, and she left him there with his vigil over the dark tree line, and made her way back toward the triage station where a long night of careful, patient work still waited, one wound and one survivor at a time, the same steady rhythm that had carried her through every crisis this house had handed her since the day the wards first chose her name. The 3 days following the battle had settled into the particular quiet rhythm of a household counting what it still had left. Selah spent long hours in the workroom finishing the last of the wounded's care, watching bruises fade and stitches come out clean, grateful, in the small unhurried spaces between patients, for the simple fact of ordinary healing after weeks of crisis after crisis. Corin had remained at Ashmere through those days rather than riding immediately home, helping Rhys sort through the practical wreckage of the siege, and Selah had begun to notice, watching the two of them work, the particular ease of two people who trusted each other's competence without needing to say so aloud. The messenger arrived on the 3rd morning after the battle, alone, unarmed, and carrying a folded parchment sealed not with Thornwick's Wolfenthorn's crest, but with a smaller, plainer seal Selah didn't recognize. He waited at the outer gate without dismounting, refusing every offer of food or rest, and when Rhys finally brought the letter up to the map room where Rhys, Selah and Corin were still sorting through the coven's post-siege accounting, Corin's face went pale the moment he saw the seal.
That's my father's personal mark, not the house seal, his own hand.
He broke it open with fingers that weren't quite steady, read the single page in silence, and set it down on the table with the particular care of a man handling something that might shatter.
What does it say?
That I'm to return to Thornwick within the week to answer formally for my defection at the battle, that the charge is treason, that my father will preside over the hearing himself, and that he has made no promises about the outcome, not even to his own son.
Rhys read the letter over Corin's shoulder, his expression darkening as he reached the final lines.
He's not asking you to come alone by accident. This is designed to isolate you before you ever reach the hall.
I know exactly what it's designed to do. I've drafted enough formal summons in my life to recognize one built for that purpose, it doesn't change what I have to do about it.
Rhys picked up the discarded letter, reading it over with a captain's practiced eye for the details a nobleman's careful phrasing might otherwise smooth over.
No mention of counsel. No mention of who else will be permitted to speak on your behalf. That's not an oversight, Corin. That's a hall being built specifically to make sure no one contradicts whatever narrative your father's council has already decided to believe.
My father doesn't operate through oversights. Everything about this summons is deliberate, down to the seal he chose to use instead of the house crest. It tells me plainly that this is a father writing to a son, not a lord writing to a subject. And I genuinely don't know yet which version of that letter frightens me more.
Selah watched him fold the parchment back along its original creases with the same careful precision he'd used to open it, and felt something in her chest tighten at the visible effort it cost him to keep his composure steady. Consider hitting subscribe before this next part, because episode 4 takes this story somewhere it hasn't gone yet, and you don't want to be catching up later. Like the video if you're already worried about what's waiting at Thornwick, and tell me in the comments whether you think Corin's father will actually protect him. Rhys crossed her arms, watching Corin with the particular assessing stillness she brought to any decision with real stakes attached.
You're not seriously considering writing into that hall alone.
I'm not considering it. I've decided it. This is a Thornwick matter, and dragging Ashmere Hollow into it further only gives my father's council more reason to see this as foreign interference rather than a domestic reckoning he needs to make on his own terms.
Selah set down the ledger she'd been holding, unable to stay quiet through the rest of this conversation.
You crashed into a blade meant to kill Rhys 3 nights ago. You stood between a coven you owed nothing to and a man who'd spent 3 centuries manipulating your own father. If that's not a debt this house owes you back, I don't know what would be.
It's not a debt you can repay by riding into my father's hall and making his son look like he needs a foreign coven to fight his own battles for him. That would hand every faction inside Thornwick who already distrusts me exactly the argument they're waiting for.
Then don't let us fight it for you. Let us stand there as witnesses. There's a difference between fighting your battle and refusing to let you face it completely alone.
Corin was quiet for a long moment, turning that over with the particular weariness of a man who'd spent the last 3 days bracing for exactly this fight, and hadn't expected to lose it to a healer's stubbornness.
You don't know my father, Selah, with respect. You don't know what that hall does to people who walk into it expecting fairness.
I didn't know Rhys either. The first night I walked through that gate expecting a monster. I've since learned that expecting the worst of someone before you've actually met them usually says more about the person doing the expecting than the person being judged.
Something in Corin's expression shifted at that, the particular give of a man who'd run out of better arguments and knew it. Rhys had been quiet through most of the exchange, watching the two of them with the particular stillness he wore when he was weighing something larger than the conversation in front of him.
I'll go, not to fight your battle, Vale, to observe it. A vampire king watching his own hall proceedings is not the same insult as a vampire king's army riding to your defense, and your father knows that distinction as well as I do.
And if he decides it's an insult regardless?
Then he decides that, and we deal with the consequences honestly, the same way we've dealt with every consequence since the night the wards first chose Scylla's name. I'm not asking your permission, Corinne. I'm telling you what I've decided. The same courtesy you'd extend me if our positions were reversed.
Corin studied him for a long moment, something that might have been reluctant gratitude moving behind his tired eyes.
Fine. Observers only. If this goes badly, I need you both to understand you may be walking into a hall that doesn't extend visitors the same courtesies Ashmere does.
Selah reached for Rhys's hand without quite meaning to, feeling the low hum of the bond settle into something steadier at the contact.
We've walked into worse rooms than that lately.
Rhys, who had been listening from the doorway with her arms crossed, spoke up before anyone could consider the matter fully settled.
I'm coming as well. Not as a soldier, since I understand exactly how that would read to a hostile council. As a witness who can carry the physical evidence and answer any technical question about the ledgers directly, since I'm the one who found them.
Rhys considered that for a moment, then nodded once, the particular decisive gesture that meant the matter was closed.
Agreed. 4 of us then. No more than that, or we risk exactly the show of force Corin's worried about.
Corin looked between the 3 of them, something that might have been the first genuine relief he'd shown, since the letter arrived, finally easing the tension in his shoulders.
4 of us. I can work with 4 of us. I appreciate all of it more than I've managed to say properly yet.
They rode for 2 full days to reach Thornwick's territory, the black pines of Ashmere Hollow giving way gradually to a colder, more open country, stone watchtowers spaced at regular, deliberate intervals along a road built wide enough for disciplined columns rather than casual travelers. Selah felt the difference before she could name it precisely, a rigidity in the architecture, in the uniform spacing of the guard posts, that spoke of a coven organized around hierarchy in a way Ashmere, for all its own old lore, had never quite managed to become.
It feels different here. Colder, and I don't mean the weather.
Thornwick was built on conquest 3 centuries before Ashmere existed as anything more than scattered holdings. Ashen Vale's line has ruled it the same rigid way since. Loyalty here isn't earned the way it's earned my house. It's assigned and expected and rarely questioned aloud.
Corin, riding just ahead of them, glanced back with a tired, humorless half-smile.
You say that like it isn't also the water I grew up swimming in. I'd like to think I've swum out of it somewhat. My father would tell you I've swum out of it recklessly.
Selah nudged her horse up alongside his, curious despite the tension of the ride, wanting to understand the man whose fate they were riding toward deciding.
What was he like before all this? Your father. I find it hard to picture the man behind a letter that cold.
Exacting, fair, in his own rigid way when he wasn't being tested by something that threatened the order he'd spent his whole rule building. He taught me to read a room the way I read that ledger evidence, at your counsel, patiently, without assuming the first explanation is the true one. I used to think that made him wise. I've since learned it can just as easily make a man slow to admit when his own judgment has been used against him.
Rhys, riding on Selah's other side, spoke quietly, more to himself than to either of them.
Holden was exacting too in his own way. I've learned to be wary of mistaking rigor for wisdom. They can look identical from the outside for a very long time before the difference actually matters.
Corin didn't answer immediately, and when he did, his voice had gone quieter, more uncertain than Selah had yet heard from him.
I keep turning that comparison over myself, riding toward this hearing. I don't know yet whether my father is a man capable of hearing hard truths from his own son, or whether he's simply another version of the same certainty that nearly destroyed both our houses. I suppose I'm about to find out, whether I'm ready to or not.
The main hall of Thornwick's seat rose out of the grey afternoon like something carved rather than built, sheer black stone, without the ivy or old tapestries that softened Ashmere's similarly ancient walls. Guards posted at intervals along the approach in matching dark uniform, with none of the individual variations Selah had grown used to among Rhys's people. Banners hung motionless from the rafters overhead, the wolf and thorn's crest repeated in severe, unbroken rows rather than displayed as a single ceremonial standard, and the overall effect struck Selah as less a place of governance than a monument built to remind everyone who entered it exactly how small they were by comparison. Lord Ashen Vale received them in a throne room rather than a study, seated on a high, unadorned stone seat with a council of a dozen elders arrayed below him in strict formal rows, and Selah understood, the moment she crossed the threshold, exactly what kind of hearing this was going to be. Lord Ashen Vale was tall and spare, older in bearing than Holden had ever managed despite whatever centuries actually separated them, silver hair cropped close and severe, pale eyes that studied the 3 of them with an unreadable, deliberate blankness that gave away nothing at all.
My son brings a vampire king and his consort into my hall unannounced. I find myself curious what Corin believes that accomplishes, beyond confirming every suspicion this council already carries about his loyalties.
They came as observers, Father, not as my defense.
A distinction you're confident this council will honor.
Rhys stepped forward slightly, his voice carrying the particular flat authority Selah had learned meant he'd already decided exactly how far he intended to push and no further.
I extend your counsel the same courtesy I'd expect extended to me in my own hall, Lord Vale. I have no standing here, and I make no claim to any. I am here to see, plainly, what happens to a man who told your council an honest and costly truth about a manipulation both our houses suffered under. What your council decides to do with that truth is entirely your own business.
Something moved behind Ashen Vale's pale eyes, brief and unreadable, and he inclined his head a fraction, neither warmth nor hostility in the gesture, simply acknowledgement.
Then observe, the hearing begins now.
He rose from the stone seat and descended 2 steps toward the assembled council, his voice carrying without effort across the vast hall.
Let the record show this council convenes to hear the formal charge against Corin Ashenvale, second of that name, on the matter of his conduct during the recent engagement at Ashmere Hollow. My son will stand before this council and answer as any citizen of this house would be required to answer, regardless of blood.
A murmur moved through the seated elders at that, quickly stilled by a single sharp glance from their lord, and Selah understood, watching the careful theatre of it, that whatever mercy Ashenvale might privately hold for his son, he had no intention of letting this hall see it demonstrated before the evidence had been weighed. If you're already feeling the weight of that throne room, drop a comment telling me what you think Ashenvale is actually thinking behind that stone face, because this hearing is about to get considerably more dangerous than anyone standing in that hall expects. The formal charge was read aloud by a council elder in flat, procedural tones: desertion of Thornwick's forces mid-engagement, direct physical assault against a fellow Thornwick lord during active combat, actions that had contributed materially to the collapse of the assault against Ashmere Hollow. Selah felt her stomach tighten at the clinical coldness of the language, stripped entirely of the context that had made Corin's choice the only honourable one available to him. She glanced sideways at Rhys, whose jaw had tightened almost imperceptibly at the recitation, and understood that he was fighting the same instinct she was, the urge to speak out of turn, to fill in everything the flat legal language had deliberately left out, and the harder discipline of trusting Corin to make that case himself, in his own words, exactly as he'd insisted on doing from the start. Corin stood alone before the council as the charge was read, spine straight, hands loose at his sides, and when the elder finished, he answered without waiting to be formally invited to speak.
I did those things. I don't contest a single fact in that charge. What I contest is the framing, because desertion implies I abandoned a cause I believed in. I turned against a war I had already spent weeks trying to stop through every legitimate channel available to me. Once I understood the alliance underpinning it was built entirely on manipulation.
An elder near the front, older and sharper-eyed than most of the rest, leaned forward with open skepticism.
Manipulation is a convenient word for a young lord's own change of heart, Corin Vale. Convince this council it means something more than that.
I have the evidence Ashmere's own captain uncovered. Watch rotation ledgers, personally signed and sealed by Holden, proving he deliberately weakened Ashmere's boundary for months to manufacture exactly the crisis he then sold to my father as justification for this alliance. I have my own testimony, given freely and at personal risk, that I opposed this alliance from its first proposal. And I have the fact that Holden himself abandoned the battlefield rather than answer for any of it once his manipulation was exposed in front of both houses.
The elder was not finished, his sharp eyes narrowing further as he pressed the point harder than Selah had expected any single councillor to dare against their lord's own son.
A convenient sequence of events, all of it surfacing only after your own actions had already been called into question. Forgive this council its skepticism, but a man facing execution for treason has considerable motive to discover evidence of a conspiracy after the fact.
Corin's composure held, though Selah saw the effort it cost him, a tightness at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there a moment before.
I understand the skepticism, Elder Marrow, and I'd hold the same doubt in your position. I'd ask you to consider the timeline honestly, though. I raised concerns about this alliance to this very council 2 months before the battle, on record, well before any question of my own conduct arose. Ask the clerk to produce the minutes from that session if you doubt my memory of it.
An older woman near the back of the council, silent until now, spoke up with the particular authority of someone rarely required to raise her voice to be heard. The minutes exist. I was present for that session myself, and I recall the objection plainly, dismissed at the time as youthful caution rather than genuine concern. I would ask this council to weigh that fact honestly before continuing to treat tonight's evidence as convenient invention, an older councilwoman said, silent until now, with the particular authority of someone rarely required to raise her voice to be heard. Elder Marrow inclined his head slightly toward her, conceding the point without fully surrendering his skepticism, and gestured for Corin to continue. Rhys, having ridden separately with the physical proof, stepped forward at Corin's nod and presented the ledger to the council directly, and Selah watched the elders pass it hand to hand with expressions that shifted slowly from skepticism toward something more troubled.
Even granting the ledger's authenticity, this council did not sanction your unilateral decision to attack a fellow Thornwick lord mid-engagement. Whatever Holden's crimes, you took a soldier's oath. That oath does not include private judgment about which orders deserve obedience.
No, it doesn't. And I'll stand here and accept whatever this council decides that means for me. But I'd ask every elder in this hall to consider honestly what obedience is actually worth. If it requires watching an ally slaughtered for reasons that had already stopped being true weeks before the first blade was drawn.
Selah felt the hall's attention shift, subtly, toward her and Rhys standing at the room's edge, and understood with a small cold lurch exactly what was coming before the elder spoke again.
The Ashmere healer stands present. I would hear directly from her what she witnessed of Holden's manipulation and of the bond she and her king share, since rumor of it has already reached this hall well ahead of her arrival.
Rhys's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and Selah felt through the bond a flare of protective tension that matched her own rising unease at being made. Suddenly, the hearing's center rather than its witness. If this whole trial has you as invested as I am, hit subscribe now, because what Selah says next in that hall changes the entire shape of this hearing, and I need you here for it. Selah stepped forward into the open space before the council, aware of every pale, assessing gaze fixed on her, and found, despite the fear climbing her spine, that the same plain honesty that had carried her through every crisis in Ashmere's halls hadn't abandoned her here.
I watched Holden poison Rhys at his own dinner table, in front of a visiting envoy from this very house. I watched him manipulate a council of elders who trusted him for 3 centuries into believing lies convenient to his own certainty. I watched him stand on a battlefield he'd manufactured and tell Rhys plainly that he'd rather see this coven fall than admit he might have been wrong about what it needed to survive.
And the bond speak plainly of that as well, healer. This council has heard it described as unfinished, forced, incomplete by the old law's own standard.
Selah felt heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment but something closer to fierce, protective anger on Rhys's behalf.
It was incomplete once, because he refused to take what wasn't freely given, even when refusing cost his own coven dearly. I chose it anyway twice, with clear eyes both times, in daylight, with no blade at my side and no crisis forcing either of us. If this council wants to weigh my testimony, weigh that fact honestly alongside it, because it tells you considerably more about the kind of King Holden was trying to destroy than any rumor traveling ahead of me ever could.
Elder Merrow leaned forward, his skepticism now aimed at a different target entirely, his tone genuinely curious rather than hostile.
You speak of choice as though it settles the matter entirely, healer. This council has watched bonds claimed under duress before, dressed up afterward in language of consent that convinces the participants far more than it convinces careful observers. What makes your account different from every other vessel who has told herself the same comfortable story?
Selah met his gaze steadily, refusing to let the challenge rattle the plain honesty she'd carried into that hole.
I understand why you'd ask that, and I won't pretend the question doesn't deserve a real answer rather than an offended one. The difference is that I told him no, plainly, on the very first night, before I understood anything else about him, and he accepted that no without argument, at real cost to his own coven's stability. A man building a comfortable story to control someone doesn't spend 3 centuries refusing the exact thing he wants most, twice, because the woman in front of him hadn't chosen it freely yet.
The councilwoman who had spoken earlier nodded slowly, something like genuine respect settling into her expression. A fair answer, and one this council will weigh accordingly. Continue, the councilwoman said. The hall fell into a heavy, considering silence and ashen veil. From his high stone seat, studied Selah for a long moment with an expression that had finally, fractionally, shifted from unreadable into something closer to genuine calculation.
This council will take a recess before rendering judgment. Corinne, you will remain within the hall's walls. The rest of you are guests of this house until this matter concludes.
He rose and departed through a side door with his elders trailing behind him, and the hall dissolved into the low murmur of a crowd released from formal silence, guards moving to escort the observers toward a waiting chamber, while Corinne remained standing alone at the center of the floor, visibly drained by the effort of the last hour. The recess chamber was smaller and less formal than the throne room, a modest stone room with a single window overlooking an inner courtyard, and Corin paced its length in tight, restless circles, while the others settled into whatever stillness they could manage.
He's going to weigh it fairly. I keep telling myself that, and I keep not quite believing it, which I suppose tells you something about how confident I actually am.
For what it's worth, I watched his face when you told him what the Ravensworth faction actually was underneath their loyalty. That wasn't the face of a man who'd already decided against you.
You didn't grow up reading that face the way I did. He spent 40 years teaching this council that his expression gives away nothing. I've had considerably more practice failing to read him than you've had succeeding at it in a single afternoon.
Rhys, seated near the window with the particular alertness of a man who never fully relaxed in unfamiliar territory, glanced toward Selah with quiet curiosity.
How did the bond feel this far from home? I find myself curious whether distance changes anything about what passes between us.
Selah considered the question honestly, reaching inward toward the familiar low hum that had become, over these past months, as constant as her own heartbeat.
Steadier than I expected, honestly. I thought leaving Ashmere might thin it somehow, the way a fire banks down when you carry it too far from its source. It hasn't. If anything, it feels sharper here, like it's working harder to compensate for how unfamiliar everything else around us is.
Rhys, standing watch near the door with her arms crossed, studied the courtyard beyond the window with the particular assessing focus of a captain cataloguing an unfamiliar territory's weaknesses.
Everything here moves in straight lines. Guard rotations, corridor traffic, even the way the servants walk. Ashmere's never managed that kind of discipline, and I'm not sure we've ever wanted to.
Is that a compliment to Thornwick or a criticism?
Neither really, just an observation. Discipline like this keeps a house standing through generations of mediocre leadership. It also means when something finally does go wrong, like Holden's rot working its way into a faction like Ravensworth, nobody's trained to notice until it's already load-bearing.
Corin, still pacing, caught the tail end of the observation and managed a tired, humorless laugh.
That's a more precise diagnosis of my own house's failure than anything this council will manage today, Captain. You should have been the one testifying.
It was there, 20 minutes into the wait, that Rhys's sharp instincts caught the first sign of real danger.
Something's wrong. That's the third time that same guard has passed this door in under 10 minutes, and he's not walking a normal patrol route.
Rhys crossed to the window, expression sharpening into the particular alertness Selah had learned meant genuine threat rather than mere caution.
Selah, what does the bond tell you right now?
Selah closed her eyes, reaching for the low, steady thread that had, since the battle, grown sensitive enough to register more than simple danger, and felt something cold and wrong settle into her stomach that had nothing to do with her own fear.
Not you, not danger to you specifically. It's diffuse, like it's reading the room rather than a single threat. Something's about to happen, and it's close.
Corin's face had gone pale, some old instinct of his own clearly recognizing the pattern before the rest of them fully understood it.
The Ravensworth faction. They were Holden's strongest allies inside this house, the ones who pushed hardest for the alliance from the start. If any part of his network survived his exposure, it survived through them.
The door burst open before Rhys could reach it, 3 armed men in Thornwick livery forcing their way in with blades already drawn, and the lead attacker's eyes went immediately, unmistakably, to Corin rather than to any of the visiting outsiders. Traitor's son doesn't get to walk out of this house breathing, whatever the council decides, the lead attacker snarled. Rhys moved first, blade already clear of its sheath, putting herself bodily between the attackers and Corin with a speed that left the lead man stumbling back a half-step in surprise. Rhys was a half-second behind her, and Selah felt the bond flare hot and immediate as he moved. No longer diffuse warning but sharp, specific danger, she could track like a lit thread through the chaos of the room.
Selah, stay back against the wall.
I can feel exactly where the danger's concentrated. Left, the one circling toward the window. He's not here for Corin at all. He's positioning to cut off the only other exit.
Rhys pivoted on the information without questioning it, meeting the flanking attacker's blade with a sharp, economical parry that sent sparks into the dim room. The third attacker lunged for Rhys directly, a wild, desperate strike that Rhys deflected with almost contemptuous ease, his own counter-strike driving the man back against the stone wall hard enough to crack the plaster behind him. "You think a foreign king's blade frightens Thornwick men?" one of the attackers demanded.
I think a man who ambushes a recess chamber with 3 swords instead of facing an open hearing has already answered that question for me.
In the brief chaos that followed, Corin himself seized a fallen guard's discarded blade and turned it against the lead attacker with the particular ferocity of a man defending not just his life, but every argument he'd made in that hall an hour before. Steel rang against steel in the narrow chamber, the lead attacker giving ground step by step under the combined pressure of Corin's fury and Rhys's relentless textbook precision, until a final desperate lunge left him overextended, and Corin's counterstrike sent the blade spinning from his hand entirely.
Yield, or the next strike doesn't stop at your weapon.
The man dropped to his knees, hands raised, breathing hard, and Selah watched Corin's face in the half-second before he lowered his own blade, seeing there the particular exhausted fury of a man who had just been forced to draw steel against his own house's colours to survive an hour after defending that same house's honour. The window-flanking attacker, seeing his companions overcome, made a final desperate break for the casement, only for Rhys to close the distance in a single fluid motion too fast for the man's eyes to fully track, wrenching the blade from his hand and pinning him against the stone sill with an ease that made the man's earlier bravado look, in hindsight, almost pitiable.
Stay very still. I would genuinely prefer not to have to explain a dead Thornwick soldier to your lord in the next 5 minutes.
The fight was over almost as quickly as it had begun, the 3 attackers subdued or fled within minutes as Thornwick's own guards, alerted by the noise, finally flooded the corridor outside. Ashen Vale himself arrived moments later, his composed stillness finally, visibly cracked by what he found in the recess chamber, his own son standing bloodied but upright over a defeated attacker, a vampire king's bond having, by every account the guards could piece together, warned the room of the ambush before it fully arrived.
Explain this to me. All of it, now.
Corin, breathing hard, blade still in hand, met his father's eyes directly for the first time since they'd arrived.
The Ravensworth faction just tried to finish what Holden started. If Selah's bond hadn't warned us in time, I would very likely be dead in this room right now, and you would be presiding over my funeral instead of my trial.
If you're feeling the tension in this room the way I am, drop a comment right now, because Ashen Vale's next decision decides everything this entire story has been building toward, and I don't think it's going to be the decision anyone expects. Ashen Vale was silent for a long, considering moment, his pale eyes moving between his son, the subdued attackers now being dragged away by his own guards, and Selah and Rhys standing together at the room's edge, still visibly bracing for further danger.
The Ravensworth line has served this house for 2 centuries. I did not believe until this moment that their loyalty had ever bent toward anyone but this throne.
They didn't bend toward Holden out of loyalty to him personally, Father. They bent because his certainty was easier to follow than the harder work of questioning an alliance you yourself had already committed to publicly. That's not treason in the way this council's been trying to name mine. It's simply cowardice dressed up as loyalty, and I'd ask you to weigh which of those 2 things this hall actually punished harder today.
Something in Ashen Vale's rigid composure finally, fully gave way, not into warmth exactly, but into something that had shed enough of its formal distance to look, for the first time, like an old man confronting the true cost of his own certainty.
Reconvene the council. I will render judgment within the hour.
He departed to make the arrangements, and in the brief quiet that followed, Selah found herself sitting on the edge of an overturned bench, hands still faintly trembling with the last of the fight's adrenaline, while Rhys knelt beside her checking for injuries she kept insisting she didn't have.
You felt that attack coming before any of us. I need you to know how much that matters beyond simply what it accomplished today.
It didn't feel like a skill. It felt like fear with somewhere useful to go, for once, instead of just sitting in my chest doing nothing.
That's what most schools are, underneath. Fear that finally learned where to point itself.
She managed a tired, genuine laugh at that, some of the tension of the last hour finally beginning to drain out of her shoulders.
I think I understand now what you meant, back at the map table in Ashmere. About being lonely, planning calmly through fear you're not allowed to show. I don't think I fully understood it until I felt it myself, in a hall full of strangers who'd have been perfectly content to see us fail.
You didn't fail. None of us did. Whatever this council decides in the next hour, that much is already settled.
The full council gathered again in the throne room within the hour precisely as promised, The attackers' exposed conspiracy, now common knowledge, running through every corner of the hall, and Selah felt the mood shift palpably from the cold procedural distance of the mornings, hearing into something considerably more uncertain. Ashen Vale took his seat and let the silence stretch a long moment before speaking, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who had spent the recess weighing something far heavier than simple politics.
This council heard testimony this morning framed around a single question: whether my son's actions constituted treason against Thornwick. I find, having watched an attempt on his life carried out within these very walls not 2 hours later, that the question this council should actually be asking is considerably larger than that.
He looked out over the gathered elders with an expression that had finally entirely shed its earlier blankness.
Holden of Ashmere did not simply manipulate one foreign king's coven. He built, patiently, over months, a faction within my own house willing to commit murder rather than see his manipulation exposed. My son recognized that rot before I did, and acted against it at cost to himself that very nearly proved fatal today. I will not stand before this council and pretend that recognizing a mistake early enough to prevent catastrophe is the same crime as causing one.
An elder near the front, the same sharp-eyed man who had pressed Corin hardest during the morning's hearing, rose slowly to his feet.
Lord Vale, with respect, this council still committed forces to that battlefield under your own authority. If we absolve Corin entirely, we implicate this house's own leadership in a decision that cost lives on both sides of a war that never needed to happen.
I am aware of exactly what that implication costs this house, and myself personally, Elder. I am not offering my son a clean vindication because none exists to offer honestly. What I am offering is this: the formal charge of treason is withdrawn. Corin Vale will stand before this council under a lesser censure for acting without sanction, and will serve a term of formal service repairing what his actions and my own poor judgment together cost this house's standing with its neighbors. That service begins with him personally overseeing the full purge of the Ravensworth faction's remaining influence within these walls.
A fair reckoning, Lord Vale, and a harder one to hand down than a clean vindication would have been. This council recognizes the difficulty in it, the councilwoman said. Elder Merrow, who had pressed Corin hardest during the morning's questioning, rose once more, his sharp expression softened now into something closer to grudging respect.
I withdraw my earlier skepticism, for whatever that's worth on the record. A man who draws steel against his own house's colors twice in one day to prove a point he could have simply argued has proven that point rather more thoroughly than words alone would have managed.
Corin, standing before the council with visible exhaustion finally showing through his composure, inclined his head slowly.
I accept that judgment, Father, all of it.
Ashen Vale's gaze shifted, finally, to Rhys and Selah standing at the hall's edge.
And to you, King of Ashmere. This house owes your coven an accounting neither of us has time to properly settle today. I will say only this: whatever debt exists between our houses after everything Holden cost us both, I intend to see it repaid honestly, in whatever form that eventually takes.
Rhys inclined his head with the particular formal courtesy he reserved for genuine respect rather than mere diplomacy.
I'll hold you to that, Lord Vale, the same way I'd expect to be held to it myself.
Ashen Vale descended the final steps from his throne, approaching Rhys and Selah directly for the first time since their arrival, his formal bearing softened just slightly by proximity.
I find I owe you a more private word than this hall permits comfortably. My son speaks of you both with a regard I have rarely heard him extend to anyone outside this house. I did not fully credit it until I watched your healer's warning save his life this afternoon.
He earned that regard on a battlefield before we ever earned his trust in return. I'd say the debt runs both directions.
Perhaps. I have spent this day learning that several things I believe settled about my own house were considerably less settled than I'd assumed. I find I am grateful for the correction, however uncomfortable the lesson.
He studied Rhys for a long moment, something almost like genuine curiosity replacing the earlier cold formality.
3 centuries on the throne, and I have never once heard of a bond doing what yours did in that recess chamber today. I confess a certain professional curiosity about it, setting aside the personal debt I owe you both.
It surprises me as much as it surprises you, Lord Vale. We're still learning its shape ourselves, one crisis at a time.
Ashen Vale's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, the closest expression of warmth Selah had seen cross his face all day.
Then I wish you both a great deal of luck discovering the rest of it somewhere considerably less dangerous than my own throne room.
The council dispersed slowly, the weight of the morning's revelations settling visibly over the hall, and it was Rhys who found Selah first in the quiet aftermath, checking her over with the same brisk efficiency she'd have applied to any battlefield casualty.
You're not hurt.
Not hurt, just considerably more tired than I expected a formal hearing to leave me.
Formal hearings aren't usually attempted assassinations halfway through. You handled that better than most trained guards would have, reading the room the way you did.
Corin approached them last, some of the exhaustion in his face finally giving way to something like genuine, cautious relief.
I owe you both considerably more than I can properly repay in a single conversation. If Selah hadn't sensed that attack coming, I don't think any of us walk out of that recess chamber today.
You already repaid that debt on a battlefield 3 nights ago, Corin. I think we're well past keeping careful count of who owes whom at this point.
Rhys, standing nearby with her arms crossed, allowed herself a rare, genuine smile at that. The particular quiet satisfaction of a captain watching 2 houses find their way towards something sturdier than mere alliance.
For what it's worth, I've fought alongside considerably worse men than you these past few months. Vale, you'll do.
High praise, Captain. I'll try to live up to it.
That night in the modest guest quarters Thornwick's household had prepared for them, Selah sat by a small window overlooking the same stern courtyard where the morning's hearing had nearly ended in bloodshed, and found Rhys settling quietly into the chair beside her, watching the last of the day's grey light fade over unfamiliar walls.
I keep thinking about what Elder Marrow asked me, about whether I told myself a comfortable story the same way every other vessel before me apparently has.
And what do you think, now that the hall's finished asking and you've had a quiet moment to actually sit with it?
I think the answer's the same one I gave him. I just didn't expect to have to defend it in a hostile hall full of strangers a season into choosing it. I suppose that's its own kind of test, in a way none of the old law's language ever quite prepared either of us for.
Rhys reached for her hand in the fading light, the bond settling quietly beneath both their skins, steady and certain, even this far from the only home either of them had built it inside.
Then we passed it, together the way we've passed everything else so far.
She leaned into him, feeling the day's accumulated exhaustion finally begin to loosen its grip, grateful for the small, ordinary mercy of a quiet room after a day that had asked so much of both of them. Tomorrow would bring the ride home, and whatever news awaited them there, but tonight at least there was simply this, a window, a fading light, and a barn that had proven itself, once again, sturdier than either of them had fully understood it could be. They prepared to leave Thornwick's grounds the following morning, the political dust still visibly settling behind them, the courtyard busy with the ordinary rhythm of a household returning slowly to something like normalcy. Corin walked them to their horses himself, his new formal duties already visibly weighing on him despite the reprieve, and lingered a moment before they mounted, something unspoken clearly still sitting behind his tired eyes.
I don't know how to properly thank either of you for what yesterday cost you on my behalf. Riding into a hostile hall, standing witness to a hearing that wasn't yours to carry, taking blades meant for me. I've spent half the night trying to find words adequate to it and failing.
You don't owe us elaborate words, Corin. You already showed us what you're made of on a battlefield, before any of us had reason to expect it from you. Yesterday just proved it wasn't a single moment of courage. It's simply who you are.
I hope Ashmere finds a way to test that theory under considerably calmer circumstances in the future. I find I'd like the chance to visit your coven under conditions that don't involve poisons, sieges, or formal trials.
You'd be welcome, Vale. Genuinely. Whatever debts either house still carries after all this, I'd count a friendship worth considerably more than any of them.
It was as their horses were being readied in the courtyard that a rider arrived at speed from the northern road, breathless and travel-worn, calling for Corin by name before he'd even fully dismounted. Lord Vale, there's word from the Northern Watch. A man matching Holden's description was sighted 2 nights past, moving through the border villages near the old Ravensworth holdings, the rider called, breathless and travel-worn. Corin's face went carefully still, the particular stillness of a man forcing himself not to react before he had the full picture.
Alone?
No, my lord, that's the trouble of it. He wasn't traveling alone. The watch counted at least a dozen others moving with him, and none of them wearing colors anyone recognized, the rider said. Rhys and Selah exchanged a single sharp glance, the bond between them settling into something taut and alert, and Selah felt beneath the fresh unease of the news, the particular grim certainty that whatever peace this hearing had brought them was going to be considerably shorter-lived than any of them had hoped. Rhys moved to the rider's side immediately, her captain's instincts already working through the practical shape of the problem.
What colors were the others wearing, if not Thornwick's or Ashmere's?
None the watch could identify, Captain. Mismatched leathers, no house crest visible on any of them. Whoever they are, they're not declaring allegiance to anyone yet, the rider said. Corin's expression had gone hard and calculating, the exhausted relief of the morning's judgment already giving way to fresh, immediate concern.
A dozen unmarked soldiers rallying around a man who just watched an entire political order turn against him. That's not a coincidence, and it's not a small thing either. Whatever he's building it fast.
Then whatever Holden's building next, it didn't die with his exposure at Ashmere or his flight from that battlefield. It simply went looking for new ground to grow in.
Ashen Vale, who had come out to see them off personally, absorbed the news with the particular grim stillness of a ruler recalculating a threat he'd believed already resolved.
The northern border villages fall within neither our territory nor yours cleanly, which means neither house has full authority to move against him there without risking exactly the kind of foreign interference accusation that nearly cost my son his standing yesterday.
Then perhaps this is a matter both houses need to address together, openly, rather than separately and quietly, the way we let his first manipulation take root in the first place.
Ashen Vale considered that for a long moment, something that looked almost like approval crossing his weathered face.
A reasonable position, and one I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, inclined to support. I will send word through proper channels. Let us not repeat the mistake of treating this as any single house's private trouble to solve alone.
Selah looked out toward the northern road, toward the distant grey hills where Holden had apparently found new purpose in the wreckage of his old certainty, and felt the bond hum quietly beneath her skin, steady even now, even here, far from the walls that had first taught her to trust it.
Then we'd better find out what he's building before it finishes growing.
The joint patrol found Holden's camp on the 9th day after the Thornwick verdict, spread across the ruined foundations of the old Ravensworth holdings like something that had grown there rather than arrived. Trevon, riding with the scouting party at Rhys's insistence, counted the fires from the tree line and rode back through the night without stopping, and by the time he reached Ashmere's gates his voice had gone hoarse from the effort of not shouting the number aloud the whole way home. 40 fires, maybe more, he reported, breathless, and Rhys herself suspected closer to 60 souls, once the ones who'd stayed carefully out of the light were counted too. Rhys stood over the war map with her jaw tight, tracing the ruined holdings with one finger.
That's not a raiding party. That's a settlement. Whatever Holden's building out there, he stopped hiding it.
Selah felt the bond hum low and steady beside her, Rhys's attention already turned fully toward the map, his expression carrying none of the raw fury she might have expected from him even a season ago.
Send word to Thornwick. Ashen Vale should hear this from us before he hears it from a frightened border village. Exaggerating the count.
Consider hitting subscribe right now, because this is the final chapter of this entire story, and after everything this series has put you through, you deserve to see exactly how it ends. Like the video before you read another line, and drop a comment telling me what you think Holden's actually building out there in those ruins. Ashen Vale arrived at Ashmere's gates 2 days later with a modest honor guard rather than a full column, a gesture Selah understood, watching Corin's quiet relief at his father's restraint as its own kind of message. He greeted Rhys and Selah both with a formal bow that had, over the months since Thornwick's trial, softened into something considerably warmer than the cold courtesy of their first meeting, and paused a moment at the sight of the coven's mended grounds, visibly taking in how thoroughly the wounds of the last siege had healed.
Your coven wears its recovery well, King of Ashmere. I confess I did not expect to find these grounds so thoroughly restored, given everything they weathered this past year.
We had considerable help rebuilding Lord Vale, not all of it from within these walls. I don't discount what your own house's support has meant to that recovery.
the two houses convened in Ashmere's great hall for the first time since the Thornwick trial, and the mood in the room carried none of the wary formality of that earlier meeting. Something steadier had grown between them in the weeks since, tested and proven under fire rather than simply declared. Guards from both houses stood mixed along the walls rather than segregated by banner, a small detail Selah noticed and quietly treasured, proof of exactly how far the two covens had travelled since the cold, rigid formality of that first Thornwick hearing.
My scouts confirm your count. 60 souls, perhaps more, and growing weekly. We could move against that camp within the fortnight with combined forces and end this before it grows larger still.
Father, before we speak of ending it, I'd ask this council to consider what it actually is we'd be ending. 60 souls didn't simply appear at Holden's call. They came from somewhere, and I think we owe it to everyone who might die in that camp to understand where, before we decide the only answer is force.
A murmur of cautious agreement moved through the gathered elders of both houses, several of them recalling aloud, in low voices to their neighbours, exactly what it had cost Thornwick to assume the worst of a man before they'd actually heard him speak. Ashen Vale absorbed the sentiment of the room with the particular patience he'd learned at real cost over these last several months.
A fair caution, and one I find myself more willing to heed than I might have been a year ago. Still, I will not send my son or this coven's king into a camp of 60 armed strangers on the strength of hope alone.
Selah stepped forward, feeling the weight of every eye in the hall settle on her the way it had in Thornwick's throne room, and found, once again, that the plain honesty which had carried her this far hadn't abandoned her.
I watched Holden stand on a battlefield and tell Rhys he'd rather see this coven fall than admit he might have been wrong. I also watched him run from that same battlefield rather than finish killing the man he'd spent 3 centuries failing to reach. That's not the behavior of a man who wants a war he's confident of winning. That's the behavior of a man who doesn't know what else to do with himself anymore and has started gathering anyone else who feels the same way.
You're proposing we simply walk into that camp and ask him to stop.
I'm proposing we try honesty before we try force, the same way this coven and yours have both learned, at real cost, that honesty tends to work better than certainty. If it fails, we'll still have every soldier either house can muster. We lose nothing by trying first, except perhaps some time we can genuinely afford to spend.
And if he uses that time to strengthen his position instead of reconsidering it?
Then we'll have learned that plainly too, and lost nothing we weren't already prepared to spend on this fight regardless. I'd rather walk away certain we tried the harder path than wonder for the rest of my life whether force was truly the only option left to us.
Rhys watched the exchange with quiet attention, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the particular settled authority Selah had learned meant he'd already decided something and simply wanted the room to arrive there with him rather than be told.
I'll go with Selah. Alone, beyond whatever escort brings us to the edge of the ruins, 2 people under a truce flag asked less of Holden's remaining trust than an army at his door. And if this fails, the army will still be exactly where we left it, ready to finish what honesty couldn't.
Ashen Vale studied Rhys for a long moment, something that might have been genuine respect settling into his weathered face.
A considerable risk, King of Ashmere. I find myself, somewhat to my own surprise, willing to grant it a chance to work before I commit soldiers to a fight. None of us will fully win, even in victory.
Rhys, arms crossed near the map table, did not look convinced, though she offered no argument beyond the tightness of her jaw.
I don't like it. I'll say that plainly and then I'll stand down, because I've watched Selah's instincts prove sharper than mine on exactly this kind of question more than once now.
Ashen Vale turned to his son, something considering moving behind his pale eyes.
And you, Corin, you knew this man better than any soul in either hall, once. What does your judgment tell you about the odds of this actually working?
Corin was quiet a long moment, weighing the question with visible care rather than answering reflexively.
I think the Holden I served for years would have laughed at the very notion of a parley, certain he already understood every possible outcome before it happened. I don't know that man anymore, Father. I watched him throw away 3 centuries of certainty in a single season, and I genuinely don't know what's left standing in the wreckage of that. I think Selah and Rhys deserve the chance to find out, the same way this house gave me that chance when it would have been easier not to. For what it's worth, Captain, I don't like it either. I'd still rather live in a world where we tried the harder, kinder path first, even when it frightens me. I think that's precisely the lesson this entire ordeal has been trying to teach all of us.
The combined force marched for the ruined holdings 3 days later, Ashmere and Thornwick soldiers moving together under a joint banner neither house had ever flown before, the two columns falling naturally into step with each other despite 3 centuries of rivalry that had, until recently, made such easy cooperation unthinkable. Selah found herself walking much of the distance beside Kaylee, who had insisted on joining as the expedition's senior healer despite her age. Kaylee observed gently that Selah's fear was no criticism to be ashamed of. Anyone walking toward that camp without fear would be a fool, and she'd never once thought Selah a fool.
I keep thinking about the last time I tried to reach someone I was afraid of. It worked, that first night in Rhys's study, because he was already looking for a reason to be reached. I don't know if Holden's looking for that anymore, or if he's past it entirely.
Kaylee only said that she'd find out honestly, the same way she'd found out everything else since arriving at these gates. That was all any of them could ask of the attempt, whatever it cost. Freddie, marching nearby with the young guards Rhys had brought along for the column's protection, fell into step beside them for a stretch, his earlier nervousness at his first true battle months ago replaced now with something steadier. He mentioned, a little shyly, that Trevon had told him how Selah had talked him through his first real fight the same honest way she was probably about to try with Holden, just staying honest until the fear had somewhere useful to go.
I don't know if it'll work the same way on a man who spent 3 centuries convincing himself fear was a weakness rather than information. I suppose we'll see.
The march itself passed in the particular rhythm of soldiers and healers, alike settling into the unfamiliar comfort of shared purpose. Ashmere's practical, unadorned banners moving alongside Thornwick's, severe Wolf-and-Thorn's crest, with none of the wary distance that might once have defined such proximity. Selah watched the two columns trade supplies and stories in equal measure as the miles passed, a Thornwick guard teaching an Ashmere counterpart some intricate knotwork, an Ashmere cook sharing a recipe for trail bread that drew genuine praise from soldiers who'd spent 3 centuries taught to view everything from this coven with suspicion. It struck Selah, watching it unfold, that this quiet, ordinary camaraderie was its own kind of victory, one that had nothing to do with the parley still waiting ahead of them. The column made camp that second night within sight of the ruined holdings' outer boundary, close enough that the distant glow of Holden's cookfires was visible through gaps in the tree line, and Selah found herself unable to sleep, sitting instead near the edge of the makeshift camp with her knees drawn to her chest, watching that distant light with an unease she couldn't fully name. Rhys found her there sometime past midnight, settling down beside her without a word for a long moment before finally breaking the silence.
You're not having second thoughts about tomorrow?
Not about the attempt, about what it means if it fails. I keep thinking about how much easier this would all be if you were simply a monster through and through. It's so much harder trying to save something in a man who's already done real, permanent damage.
I don't think easier and right have ever once been the same thing in this house, since the night the wards chose your name. I've stopped expecting them to align, honestly. It makes the harder choices simpler, in a strange way, once you stop hoping for the easy version to also be the correct one.
Selah managed a tired, genuine laugh at that, some of the tension in her shoulders finally easing.
That might be the most honest thing anyone in this coven has ever said to me, and I've heard a great many honest things in this coven.
Some distance away, near the edge of the same makeshift camp, Rhys found Corin sitting alone with a small untouched cup of wine, staring toward the same distant glow of cookfires that had kept Selah from sleep.
You should try to rest. Tomorrow asks a great deal of all of us.
I keep thinking about the last real conversation I had with him before everything unraveled. He told me once that mercy was a luxury covens with real enemies couldn't afford. I believed him for longer than I'm comfortable admitting now.
I believed a version of that too, once, a very long time ago. It took losing considerably more than I was prepared to lose before I learned otherwise. I don't think you should carry guilt for having trusted a man who spent 3 centuries convincing an entire coven he'd earned that trust honestly.
I don't carry guilt for trusting him then. I carry something closer to grief, watching what he's become since, and not knowing yet whether tomorrow ends with him reachable or with all of us burying more people over his certainty. I find those two feelings sit closer together than I expected them to.
Rhys settled down beside him, quiet for a long moment before speaking again.
For what it's worth, I think grief and hope are allowed to sit in the same chest at once. I've been carrying both of them myself since the day the wards first cracked. I don't think either of us would be walking toward that camp tomorrow if some part of us hadn't already decided hope was worth the risk.
Corin managed a tired, grateful smile at that, setting his still untouched cup aside.
Thank you, Rhys, not only for the counsel, for trusting me enough to ride toward this at all, after everything my house cost yours this past year.
We're well past keeping careful accounts of who owes whom, Corin. I think we settled that particular ledger a long time ago.
They reached the tree line overlooking the ruined holdings on the evening of the third day, and Selah felt her breath catch at the sight spread below them in the fading light. Not a war camp bristling with weapons, but something closer to a ragged, makeshift village, cookfires and mended tents, and the ordinary, exhausted rhythms of people who had nowhere else left to go.
Look at them. Really look, before either of us decides what we think we're seeing.
Selah studied the camp with a healer's eye rather than a soldier's, cataloguing the shapes moving between the fires, old wounds still healing on more than a few thin faces, the particular hunched posture of people who had been running from something for a long time before they'd stopped to build even this much shelter.
These aren't soldiers, Rhys. Some of them maybe, but most of this camp looks like refugees, people with nowhere else that would take them.
Rhys, crouched nearby scanning the camp's perimeter with a captain's practiced eye, confirmed the read with grim precision.
I count maybe 15 who move like trained fighters. The rest are exactly what Selah's describing. Whatever Holden's built out here, it isn't an army in the way Ashen Vale feared. It's something closer to a refuge for anyone this war left with nothing. No watchtowers built, no defensive earthworks, nothing that suggests a man preparing for a siege. Whatever he's doing out here, it isn't military planning.
Ashen Vale's own scouts, positioned at the tree line alongside Rhys, murmured similar assessments among themselves, the particular quiet recalculation of soldiers who had ridden expecting one kind of threat and found something considerably harder to categorize instead. Corin's expression had gone complicated, something like grief moving behind his careful composure.
The Ravensworth faction's families, the ones who lost everything when their conspiracy was exposed, exiled from Thornwick with nowhere to go and no one willing to take them in. I didn't think about where they'd end up once we'd finished the necessary work of exposing them.
None of us did, if I'm honest. We were so focused on ending the threat that none of us stopped to ask what became of everyone left standing in the wreckage of it. That failure belongs to all three of us, not only to Holden.
Selah watched a child dart between two of the distant fires, chasing after something too small to make out clearly at this distance, and felt the shape of the whole ordeal settle differently in her chest than it had a moment before. An older child scooped the small one up a moment later, laughing, the two of them tumbling together into the grass beside one of the mended tents, and Selah felt something in her resolve harden at the ordinary, unguarded innocence of it.
There are children down there, Rhys. Whatever else this camp is, it's also that. I don't think we get to treat it as a simple military problem anymore, if it ever truly was one.
If this whole camp isn't what you expected either, drop a comment right now, because what Selah's about to do walking into it changes everything about how this story ends, and I need you here for it. Selah turned to Rhys, feeling the shape of the plan shift under the weight of what they were actually looking at.
This isn't a battle to win, Rhys. This is a wound this whole war left open, and Holden's the only one who seems to have noticed it was still bleeding.
Rhys was quiet a moment, his gaze moving slowly over the ragged, makeshift settlement below, before he finally answered, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man revising a decision already half-made.
Then let's go find out what he thinks he's doing about it.
They descended toward the camp alone as agreed, a single white cloth tied to a raised spear the only announcement of their intent, and Selah felt every eye in the settlement turn toward them as they crossed the ruined outer wall, tension rippling outward from the fires like something physical. Rhys's hand found hers briefly before they crossed the final stretch of open ground, a small, steadying gesture neither of them needed words to explain. The camp fell quiet in stages as they walked deeper in, conversations dying, work pausing, dozens of wary eyes tracking their slow progress toward the largest of the ruined structures at the settlement's center. Selah kept her chin level and her pace unhurried, remembering the same lesson she'd carried into Thornwick's hostel throne room months before, That fear shown plainly, without shame, unsettled a room considerably less than fear hidden behind false bravado. A young guard intercepted them before they'd gone 20 paces, blade half-drawn, clearly unprepared for the sight of a vampire king and his consort walking calmly into the middle of his camp, and ordered them to state their business before he called the elder.
We're here to speak with Holden. Only to speak under the flag you can see plainly in my hand. Whatever comes after that conversation is his choice to make, not something I've come to force on him.
The young guard hesitated, clearly weighing the risk of the request against the risk of refusing a vampire king anything, and finally turned to call over his shoulder toward the largest of the ruined structures still standing at the camp's center. Holden emerged from the shadowed doorway a long moment later, and Selah felt something in her chest tight at the sight of him, thinner than she remembered, his once immaculate court robes replaced by simple, mended traveling clothes, the cold marble certainty that had armored him through 3 centuries visibly, permanently cracked. He moved slower than she remembered too, not from injury, but from something closer to the particular weariness of a man who had stopped performing strength for anyone watching. His silver hair, once severely combed, had grown out slightly, softening the harsh lines of his face into something that read, for the first time since Selah had known him, as simply tired rather than cold.
I did not expect either of you to walk into this camp without an army at your backs.
I didn't come to fight you, Holden. I came because Selah looked at what you'd built out here and told me it wasn't the war Thornwick feared. I'd like to hear from you directly whether she's right.
Holden's gaze moved to Selah, something complicated passing behind his pale eyes at the sight of her standing there so plainly, unafraid, exactly as she'd stood before him in Ashmere's study all those months ago.
You always did have a talent for seeing past what I wanted people to assume about me, apothecary. I find it hasn't dulled with distance.
I'm not here to flatter you, Holden. I'm here because I think there's still a version of tonight that doesn't end with more graves. I'd like to find out if you agree.
Holden studied them both for a long, considering moment, something old and exhausted moving behind his pale eyes.
Walk with me. I find I owe you both an honest conversation, whatever comes after it.
He led them slowly through the camp, past cookfires and mended tents, past faces that watched the vampire king pass with a mixture of fear and something closer to cautious curiosity. And Selah understood, watching him move among these people, that whatever authority he'd once wielded through fear and certainty had been replaced by something considerably more fragile and strangely more genuine. An old woman mending a torn cloak by firelight nodded to Holden as he passed, unafraid, the particular easy familiarity of someone who had come to trust him despite everything his name once meant. A young man missing part of one arm, clearly a Ravensworth soldier from the fighting months before, offered Holden a respectful nod that carried none of the fear Selah might have expected from a man who'd lost so much to the very conspiracy Holden had exposed.
They don't look at you the way I expected them to.
They know exactly what I did to both our houses. I've never once hidden it from them or asked them to forget it. I think strangely, that's precisely why some of them stayed. They'd had enough of leaders who pretended their failures away.
Rhys studied the camp around them with fresh eyes at that, weighing the claim against everything he could see plainly in the faces watching them pass.
Tell me plainly then, who are they and why did they come to you rather than to either of our houses directly?
They came to me because no one else would have them. The Ravensworth families, exiled with nothing. A handful of Ashmere's own wounded who lost everything in the siege I helped cause and couldn't face returning to a coven that remembers exactly what that cost them. Rogues from 3 different territories who've been living wild in the woods since long before any of this began. I did not set out to build an army, whatever Thornwick scouts reported. I set out to stop being useless, and this was the only usefulness I could find left to me.
You could have come back, told the truth, asked for a chance to make amends the honest way, the way Corin did.
Corin had a father willing to hear him, and a coven that had already begun forgiving him before he ever rode home. I burned every bridge I had 3 centuries building in a single season, and I did it with my own hands, fully aware of what I was doing while I did it. There was no honest path left back into either hall that didn't end with a rope or a blade, and I found I wasn't yet ready to face that particular reckoning directly.
Hit subscribe now if you want to see exactly how this confrontation resolves, because what Rhys says to Holden next is the moment this entire 5-episode story has been quietly building toward since the very first night. Rhys stopped walking, turning to face Holden directly in the fading light between two of the camp's cookfires.
Then face it now, not with a rope or a blade, with the truth spoken plainly to the people you actually wronged. I did not come here to execute you, Holden. I came here because 3 centuries of history doesn't simply stop mattering the moment it becomes inconvenient. And I find I'm not willing to let it end in a war neither of us actually wants.
Holden's composure, already thin, finally, fully broke. Something raw and unguarded surfacing in his expression that Selah had never once seen from him, even in his worst moments of fury.
I don't know how to be forgiven, Rhys. I have spent 3 centuries certain that softness was the danger, and now I stand in the wreckage of everything that certainty cost both our houses, and I find I don't have the first idea what a man like me is supposed to do with mercy, even if it's genuinely offered.
Selah stepped forward, feeling the particular clarity that had carried her through every crisis this whole ordeal had handed her settle over the moment.
You start by choosing it, the same way I chose you, Rhys, twice, with clear eyes both times. Mercy isn't something that happens to you, Holden. It's something you have to actually reach for, and keep reaching for, every day it feels undeserved. I think you've been standing in this camp doing exactly that for weeks now, whether you've let yourself name it that way or not.
Holden was quiet a long moment, looking out over the fires of the camp he'd built from nothing but the wreckage of his own certainty, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone rougher, more uncertain than Selah had ever heard it.
I keep thinking of Alara, the girl she was or would have been if she'd lived long enough to have opinions about the man I became instead of her. I built 3 centuries of rule on the theory that certainty would have protected her if only I'd had enough of it soon enough. I wonder now whether she'd have recognized anything of the brother she knew in the man I let myself become chasing that theory.
I never knew her. I know you, though, and I've watched you spend the last several weeks becoming something considerably closer to the man you described missing than the one you spent 3 centuries building. I think that counts for something, Holden, whatever the final accounting looks like.
Holden managed a faint, unsteady laugh, the sound of a man surprised by his own capacity for hope, after having spent so long convinced he'd exhausted it entirely.
Then, perhaps, there's still a version of this that ends without either of our houses burying more of their people over my failures. I find, standing here, that I would very much like to discover what that version looks like.
Something in Holden's face cracked further at that, and for a long, fragile moment, Selah believed genuinely that they had found the ending this whole story actually needed. The fires around them burned low and steady, the camp settling into its evening rhythms, and for one suspended breath the whole ruined settlement felt impossibly like a place peace might actually take root. It was in that exact moment that the fragile peace shattered. A group of armed men broke from the shadows at the camp's northern edge, blades already drawn, moving with the particular coordinated speed of soldiers rather than desperate refugees, and their leader called out across the camp with cold, familiar certainty that the vampire king had walked in unguarded, and he hadn't followed Holden this far only to watch him make peace with the man who'd ruined every life in this camp. Holden's expression shifted instantly from raw vulnerability to sharp, immediate alarm, his body already turning toward the threat with old, practiced authority.
Stand down. This is not what we agreed to when I took you in.
The leader spat back that they'd been taken in and promised purpose, and this was that purpose, ending the war properly, not surrendering to the men who'd left them with nothing. The splinter faction surged forward, perhaps a dozen armed men moving on Rhys and Selah with the particular reckless speed of people who had nothing left to lose, and Selah felt the bond flare hot and immediate as Rhys moved between her and the charging line, his blade already clear despite having come unarmed for combat, some old instinct pulling a hidden knife from his boot in a single fluid motion.
Selah behind me, now.
Holden did not hesitate. He placed himself directly between the splinter faction and the 2 people he'd spent the last several minutes finally, fully unburdening himself too, his own blade drawn with the terrible, practiced speed of 3 centuries of combat experience.
You will not do this in my name, not after everything it's already cost.
The leader sneered back that he was as soft as they'd always said, and told him to stand aside or fall with them. Holden did not stand aside. He met the leader's first strike with a parry that rang out across the camp like a bell, and Selah watched, heart hammering, as the man who had spent 3 seasons trying to destroy Rhys through careful manipulation now fought with everything he had left to protect him instead. The fight that followed was brief, brutal, and entirely unlike the practiced, careful violence Selah had watched Holden wield in the throne room weeks before. This was desperate, protective, a man fighting not for his own certainty, but for the fragile, unfinished thing he'd only just found the courage to reach toward. Rhys moved to join him, blades flashing in the firelight, the two of them fighting side by side against a threat neither of them had chosen, and Selah, pressed against the ruined stone wall behind them, felt every strike land through the bond like a physical echo in her own chest. The camp around them had dissolved into chaos, frightened residents scattering toward whatever shelter the ruined structures still offered, a few of the trained fighters among them moving to help hold the splinter faction's remaining soldiers at bay rather than join the attack, a small, telling sign of exactly where the camp's true loyalties had settled despite everything. It was the splinter leader's final, desperate strike that found its mark, not on Rhys, whom Holden had deliberately positioned himself to shield, but on Holden himself, a vicious blade driven deep beneath his ribs in the same instant Rhys's own counterstrike ended the threat permanently. Holden staggered, blade falling from suddenly nerveless fingers, and Selah was moving before conscious thought caught up, healer's instinct overriding every ounce of remaining fear as she dropped to her knees beside him in the mud.
Stay with me. Do you hear me, Holden? Stay with me the same way I asked him to, the same way it worked.
Holden's pale eyes found hers, something almost peaceful settling into his expression despite the visible pain.
I don't think this is the same kind of wound, Selah. I've lived 3 centuries. I know precisely what a mortal blow feels like when it finally arrives, and I find, strangely, that I'm not as frightened of it as I expected to be.
Rhys knelt on his other side, his own composure visibly cracking for the first time since the fight began.
You don't get to die believing you were never forgiven, Holden. Not after what you just did.
Holden managed something that might have been a faint, genuine smile, the first Selah had ever seen cross his face without cold calculation behind it.
Then don't let me believe that. Tell me honestly, both of you, whatever it costs to say it, because I find I would very much like to hear it plainly before whatever comes next.
Selah gripped his hand, feeling the particular fragile honesty of the moment settle over her, refusing to offer him a comfortable lie even now.
I don't think what you did can simply be forgiven in a single sentence, Holden. I think it's going to take longer than the time you have left to fully make peace with. But I watched you throw yourself between a blade and the man you spent 3 centuries trying to destroy, and I believe completely that the man who did that tonight was reaching for something real. That has to count for something, even if it doesn't erase everything that came before it.
I forgive you, Holden. Not because it undoes anything, because I watched you become in your final moments the man I always believed you were capable of being underneath 3 centuries of certainty. That man deserved better than the ending you were racing toward before tonight.
Holden's gaze drifted briefly toward the ruined camp around them, toward the fires still burning, and the frightened, watching faces gathered at a careful distance, and something like peace settled fully into his expression for the first time since Selah had known him.
Look after them if you're able. Not out of obligation to me, because they never asked to become collateral in a war I started, and they deserve better than to be abandoned twice in one lifetime.
You have my word, Holden. Ashmere's gates will stand open to every soul in this camp for as long as they need them.
I promise you that, Holden. Whatever else remains unsettled between us, I promise you that plainly.
Holden's breathing had gone shallow, his grip on Selah's hand weakening by degrees, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone almost peaceful, stripped entirely of the cold authority that had defined him for so long.
Tell the camp they're welcome at Ashmere, if they'll have them. Tell Ashenvale the Ravensworth families deserve a home, not a punishment they never chose. And tell Corin, tell him I'm proud of the man he became in spite of everything I tried to teach him about strength.
Corin arrived at a run in that exact moment, having heard the fighting from the tree line where the main column waited, and dropped to his knees on Holden's other side, something raw and grieving breaking across his careful composure.
I'm here, Holden. I'm here.
Holden's eyes found him, and whatever remained of his old, rigid distance finally, completely dissolved.
You already surpassed everything I hoped you'd become. I only wish I'd told you that while I still had the certainty to mean it plainly, instead of waiting until the very end to find the words.
His breathing slowed, then stilled, and the camp around them fell into a heavy morning silence, the fires burning low against the deepening dark, and Selah, still gripping his now still hand, found that the tears on her face surprised her less than the depth of the grief actually sitting beneath them. The days that followed blurred together in the particular exhausted rhythm of aftermath, the splinter factions remaining conspirators taken into custody, the refugee camp's residents given the choice of Ashmere's shelter or safe passage wherever else they wished to go, most choosing, to Selah's quiet relief, to follow Corin back toward a Thornwick finally willing to make room for them. Selah spent much of that first week tending the camp's wounded directly, working alongside Kaylee and two of the camp's own untrained healers, teaching what she could of proper wound care in the brief, exhausted hours between crises, grateful, in the small, unhurried spaces between patients, that this particular kind of work had never once stopped feeling like the truest thing she knew how to do. The young man missing part of his arm, the one who'd nodded so easily to Holden the evening they'd first arrived, sought her out on the third day, sitting with her by the fire while she rewrapped the healing stump with careful, practiced hands. He told her, unprompted, that he'd lost the arm fighting for the Ravensworth cause before he'd ever understood what that cause had actually been built on, and that he'd come to this camp expecting nothing but another kind of using, another leader with plans that didn't much account for what happened to the people carrying them out. What he'd found instead, he said, was a man who asked nothing of him he hadn't first been honest about wanting, and who'd looked him in the eye the whole time he explained exactly how badly he'd once been failed by people claiming to protect him. That honesty, more than anything else, was why he'd stayed. Selah thought about that conversation often in the weeks that followed, turning it over the way she might turn over a difficult diagnosis, trying to understand the full shape of a man capable of both the manipulation that had nearly destroyed 2 houses and the plain, costly honesty that had apparently rebuilt something real in its wreckage. She did not think she would ever fully resolve that particular tension, and had come slowly to accept that some people simply couldn't be reduced to a single tidy verdict, however much easier that verdict might have made the grieving. The old woman who had mended cloaks by firelight, whose name Selah learned was Merit, found her on the second day, pressing a small carved wooden bird into her hands with fingers gnarled from decades of needlework. Merit's own words, offered quietly as she pressed the gift into Selah's palm, were that she'd carved it the night word spread through the camp of what Holden had done, throwing himself between a blade and the 2 visitors who'd come only to talk. She'd wanted Selah to have something to remember that not every soul in this camp had come only for violence, whatever the fighting at the end had looked like. Selah kept the small carving in her healer's satchel from that day forward, tucked beside the herbs and bandages that had carried her through every crisis this whole ordeal had handed her, a small, quiet reminder that even the most complicated endings sometimes left something worth keeping behind them. Holden was buried at the edge of Ashmere's own grounds, not in the coven's formal crypts among the honoured dead, but in a quiet plot overlooking the mended northern wall he'd once nearly destroyed, at Rhys's own insistence. The gathering was small and quiet, none of the formal pageantry the coven usually reserved for its honoured dead, but a surprising number of the camp's own former residents had made the journey to attend, standing at a respectful distance among Ashmere's own household, a testament, however complicated, to the particular loyalty he'd earned in his final weeks. No headstone bore any grand title or record of his 3 centuries of rule, only a plain marker, set at Rhys's own request, carrying nothing but his name and a single line beneath it. He chose the harder path when it mattered most.
He spent 3 centuries protecting this boundary, even when his own methods betrayed everything that protection was supposed to mean. I won't pretend the ending erases that history. I also won't pretend it didn't matter, in the end, that he finally chose the harder, better path when it counted most.
Ashen Vale attended the small ceremony himself, standing beside Corin with a formality that had, over these last weeks, softened into something closer to genuine warmth between father and son.
I find myself grateful, strangely, for a man who caused this house more grief than any enemy in 3 centuries of my own rule. Without his failure, I doubt my son and I would have found our way back to each other as honestly as we have. I don't know what to do with gratitude that complicated, but I find I'm not willing to pretend it isn't real.
I think that's simply what it means to actually reckon with someone honestly, Father. The good and the terrible held together without pretending either one cancels out the other.
Rhys stood a little apart from the gathered mourners, watching the small stone marker being set into the earth with an expression Selah hadn't often seen cross the captain's usually guarded face.
I spent months wanting nothing more than to put a blade through that man myself. I find I can't quite manage to feel triumphant standing here now, watching him buried with this much genuine grief around him. I don't know what to do with that, honestly.
I don't think you're meant to resolve it neatly, Rhys. I think that's simply what it costs to have actually known someone honestly, instead of only knowing the worst version of what they did.
Rhys considered that for a long moment, then nodded once, the particular economical gesture that had become, over these last months, the closest thing to full agreement the captain ever offered. The camp's refugees who had made the journey lingered a while after the small ceremony concluded, standing quietly at a respectful distance among Ashmere's own mourners, and Selah found herself standing beside Merritt as the old woman watched the last of the earth being settled over the new grave, her carved wooden bird still resting safely in Selah's satchel. Merritt spoke quietly, almost to herself, that she'd buried 3 husbands and outlived every child she'd ever borne, and had long since stopped believing any grief could still surprise her with its size, until tonight, watching a man she'd known for barely a season laid to rest by people who'd once had every reason to hate him instead.
I think that's simply what happens when someone finally shows you who they actually are, underneath everything they spent years pretending to be. It surprises the grief into being larger than you expected, because the person you're mourning turns out to be more complicated than the simple villain you'd prepared yourself to bury.
Merritt only nodded, patting Selah's hand once with fingers gone soft and worn from decades of careful work, before turning to walk slowly back toward the small tents Ashmere's household had prepared for the camp's remaining guests. That evening, in the quiet of Ashmere's gardens, Selah found Rhys standing alone near the mended ward stones, watching the last light fade over the black pines with an expression she'd come to recognize as his particular way of processing grief too large for words.
You're thinking about the century you stopped counting.
I'm thinking that I spent 300 years believing that century was the worst thing I'd ever have to carry. I find tonight that watching a man I once called my oldest ally die, reaching for the very thing he'd spent centuries convinced he couldn't afford, might be worse. Not because it hurts more, because it's so much harder to know what to do with afterward.
Selah reached for his hand, feeling the bond settle into something steady and grounding beneath the weight of the evening.
You do what we've done with everything else this house has handed us. You carry it honestly, and you let it change how you lead going forward, instead of pretending it didn't happen at all.
Rhys turned to face her fully, something in his expression shifting from grief into a different kind of gravity entirely.
I've been thinking about something else too these last few days, about what kind of ending we actually want for ourselves now that the immediate danger's finally passed. You once told me you wanted forever, eventually, when you were ready. I find myself wondering if you've had time yet to decide what ready actually feels like.
Selah considered the question with the same honesty that had carried her through every crisis this bond had handed her, feeling the low, steady hum beneath her skin that had become, over these last months, as familiar as her own heartbeat.
I don't think I'm fully ready tonight, if I'm being honest with you the way I've promised to always be. I watched a man die today reaching for a redemption he'd spent centuries convinced he didn't deserve, and some part of me wants to sit with that a while longer before I make a choice this permanent. But I know, more certainly than I've known almost anything, that the answer is still yes eventually. I'm simply asking for the same thing you once gave me. Time chosen honestly, without a crisis forcing the timeline.
Then you have it, for as long as you need it. I told you once I'd wait 300 more years rather than take it any other way, and I meant every word of that then. I mean it considerably more now, having watched exactly what waiting the wrong way costs a person.
If this entire series has meant something to you the way it's meant something to me writing it, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment telling me your favorite moment across all 5 episodes, because this story is nearly finished, and I want to know what stayed with you most before we close it out together. 3 months later, on a bright morning that carried none of the eternal Gothic dusk Selah had first associated with this coven, Ashmere Hollow held its first formal peace ceremony with Thornwick in living memory, the 2 houses' banners raised together above the mended northern wall for the first time in 3 centuries of uneasy rivalry. Selah stood beside Rhys on the dais overlooking the gathered crowd, wearing not the simple healer's clothes she'd arrived in months ago but something finer, though still practical enough to move freely in, and felt the particular vertigo of standing somewhere she'd never once imagined herself capable of belonging. Rhys, standing at parade rest near the dais with the particular pride she rarely let show openly, caught Selah's eye and offered the smallest, genuine smile.
You did good, apothecary. Better than good. I don't think this coven survives the last year without you standing exactly where you're standing right now.
I think this coven survives because everyone in it decided, one honest choice at a time, that trust was worth rebuilding even after it broke. I only did my part of that. You did yours too, Captain, more times than either of us has properly counted.
Rhys inclined her head at that, something almost bashful crossing her usually unreadable expression, before recovering her composure with a small, dry huff of laughter. Kaylee, beside her, nodded in firm agreement, adding quietly that Thornwick likely wouldn't have survived it either, though she doubted their council would ever formally admit as much. Some truths, she said, only needed to be true, they didn't require official recognition to matter. Corin approached the dais with Trevon and Freddie trailing behind him, the three of them having become, over these last months, an unlikely and genuine friendship forged in shared crisis, rather than formal alliance.
My father asked me to formally propose a standing treaty between our houses. Joint border patrols, shared intelligence, mutual defense against exactly the kind of manipulation that nearly destroyed us both. I told him I already knew what your answer would be.
You told him correctly. Ashmere accepts, gladly, and with considerably more trust than either of our houses managed to extend each other a year ago.
I've asked to oversee the joint patrol program myself, once my formal service term concludes. I find I'd like to spend the next several years building something that lasts, rather than simply cleaning up after something that didn't.
Then Ashmere looks forward to considerably more of your company in the years ahead, Corin. I mean that plainly, not only as a matter of treaty.
Corin's expression shifted into something warmer, less formal than the careful diplomatic bearing he'd carried through most of their acquaintance.
I find I mean the same, Rhys. Whatever else this year cost all of us, I don't think I'd trade the friendship it built between our houses for an easier path that never tested it this thoroughly.
Selah, standing close beside Rhys, added her own quiet agreement to the moment.
I don't think any of us would, honestly. I've come to believe the hardest paths tend to build the sturdiest things, provided you're willing to keep choosing them honestly the whole way through.
As the formal ceremony concluded, and the crowd began to disperse into the celebration that followed, Selah wandered among the gathered guests for a while, finding, in small, unhurried conversations, all the ordinary evidence of a year's worth of hard-won change. Trevon, now fully recovered and recently promoted to lead his own patrol rotation, introduced her proudly to a Thornwick guard he'd apparently spent the better part of the joint patrols becoming close friends with, the two of them trading good-natured complaints about their respective commanding officers with the easy familiarity of soldiers who'd stopped seeing each other as rivals months ago. Freddie had taken to helping in the healer's workroom on his off days, and confessed to Selah, a little sheepishly, that he'd started keeping his own notes on wound care, in case anyone ever needed a second set of trained hands the way she'd once needed hers. Merritt had come too, at Selah's own quiet invitation, settled now in one of the modest cottages Ashmere had built for the camp's resettled families along the coven's southern edge, her small carving skills already put to work mending toys and trinkets for the growing handful of children who now called these grounds home. She found Selah near the refreshment tables and pressed her weathered hand briefly over Selah's own, saying nothing at all, the particular wordless gratitude of someone who had learned, over one difficult year, that some things were better simply felt than spoken aloud. She found Ashen Vale near the mended wall, studying the joined banners with an expression that had, over these last months, settled into something considerably warmer than the cold formality she remembered from their first meeting, the wind catching the fabric of both houses' colours and tangling them briefly together before letting them fall loose again.
I find myself thinking, standing here, that I spent 40 years ruling Thornwick on the theory that strength meant never admitting when I'd been wrong. My son taught me otherwise at considerable cost to himself. I don't think I've properly thanked either of you for the part you played in that particular education.
You don't owe me thanks, Lord Vale. I think you did the harder work yourself, choosing to actually hear it once it was offered.
Perhaps. I find gratitude easier to offer than I once did, regardless of who did the harder work. Consider it offered, plainly the way your own house seems to prefer these things said.
He glanced toward Corin, laughing easily with Trevon and Freddie near the refreshment tables, something unmistakably proud settling into his weathered features.
I find I no longer recognize the rigid house I ruled a year ago, watching my own son laugh that freely among soldiers who once wore a rival's colors. I don't know that I've thanked you both properly for that transformation either. Whatever share of credit belongs to you rather than to time itself.
I think most of the credit belongs to Corin, honestly. He simply needed a house willing to let him become who he already was underneath all that careful formality.
Ashen Vale considered that for a long moment, something almost wistful crossing his composed face.
A fair assessment, and one I intend to spend considerably more effort living up to going forward.
She found a quiet moment alone with Rhys at the edge of the gathering, looking out over a coven that had, over the course of one impossible year, become fully and completely home.
Do you remember what you told me that very first night? That the wards choose, but they don't consent for me.
I remember every word of it. I've thought about that promise more than any other vow I've made in 3 centuries of ruling.
I think I finally understand what it actually meant, standing here now. Not just permission to refuse you. Permission to choose you, slowly, honestly, on my own terms, for as long as it actually took to mean it completely. I don't think I fully knew, that first night, that choosing someone properly is its own kind of forever, whether or not I ever choose the blood and the eternity that goes with it.
Rhys reached for her hand, the bond between them settling into something that had weathered war, betrayal, grief, and finally, hard-won peace, and found in that settling something considerably steadier than either of them had believed possible the night the wards first chose her name.
Then whatever you choose, whenever you choose it, I'll still be exactly here. 300 years taught me how to wait for something worth having. I find I've discovered this last year that waiting was never actually the hard part. The hard part was learning what to do once the thing I'd waited for finally chose to stay.
Selah looked out over the celebration spreading across the mended grounds, at Rhys and Kaylee deep in conversation near the gates, at Corin laughing at something Freddie had said, at the banners of 2 once-rival houses moving together in the same evening wind, and felt the low, steady hum of the bond beneath her skin settle into something that had finally, completely, stopped feeling like a question and started feeling, simply like home. She thought, standing there, of the apothecary's shop on Miller Street, gone now to whatever hands had taken it over in the year since the wards first marked her name, and found she carried no grief for it, only a distant, fond memory of the woman she'd been before she'd learned exactly how much choosing something honestly could cost, and how much it could give back in return. She thought of the wards choosing her that summer afternoon, of the carriage ride up the mountain road with her chin lifted and her spine straight, certain she was walking toward the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She thought of Rhys refusing her twice at real cost, rather than take what wasn't freely given, and of Holden, buried now at the edge of these same mended grounds, having finally, in his last unguarded moments, reached for the very thing 3 centuries of certainty had convinced him he couldn't afford.
I keep thinking about something Holden said, near the end, that he didn't know how to be forgiven. I think I understand that fear a little better now than I did when he first said it.
What do you understand about it?
That forgiveness isn't really the hard part once you actually decide to offer it honestly. The hard part is learning to trust that you're allowed to keep the thing you fought for once you've finally got it. I think that's what he never quite managed, even at the very end. I don't want that to be true of either of us, whatever comes next.
Rhys turned to face her fully, something steady and certain settling into his expression despite the weight of everything the day had carried.
Then we won't let it be. I spent 300 years learning what it costs to hold something at arm's length out of fear of losing it eventually. I find I'm considerably more interested, these days, in learning what it means to simply keep choosing you, plainly, for as long as either of us has left to choose anything at all.
Then that's what we'll do. Together, the way we've done everything else since the night you told me the wards don't get to speak for me. I think that's the only vow either of us actually needs, whatever else comes wrapped in ceremony or blood eventually.
Then consider it made, here, now, in this garden, with no crown and no crisis forcing either of us. I choose you, Selah, today and whatever tomorrow decides to ask of us next.
Selah leaned into him, feeling the day's accumulated weight finally begin to ease, grateful for the particular hard-won piece of a home that had asked everything of her and given in return more than she'd ever once believed herself capable of receiving. She thought of her mother, sorting herbs by lamplight all those years ago, telling her that fear didn't get to decide what happened next so long as she made herself useful enough. She had spent a whole year discovering exactly how far that lesson could carry a person, through a locked door she'd chosen not to lock, through a bond taken in desperation and chosen again in daylight, through a war neither house had wanted and a parley neither house had believed could work, through the particular complicated grief of burying a man who had once tried to destroy everything she loved and had, in his final moments, become the very thing he'd spent 3 centuries convinced he couldn't afford to be. She did not know, standing here now with the bond humming steady beneath her skin, exactly what shape the rest of her life would take, whether eternity would eventually become the answer or whether some other, equally honest choice waited further down the road neither of them had finished walking yet. She knew only that whatever came, she intended to meet it the same way she'd met everything since the wards first chose her name, standing, chin lifted, choosing it plainly with clear eyes, for as long as it took to mean it completely. Somewhere beneath all of it, quiet and unhurried, the old question of eternity still waited, unanswered and unpressed, exactly the way both of them had chosen to leave it. Not a wound left open by accident, but a door left deliberately unlocked, for whenever the day came that walking through it finally felt like the truest choice either of them had left to make.